How long was Snow White in production, Walt?
I actually started to plan the picture about 1935, and I fooled around with it, trying to get a hold of a story and things for a couple of years, and finally it began to gel. Then I went to work on it, and I finished it the fall of 1938. I didn't know what I had or what would happen or anything. We had the family fortune. We had everything wrapped up in Snow White. In fact, the banker, I think, was losing more sleep than I was.
In 1933, Walt Disney was riding high off a string of successive successes in the animation industry. These successes included, in 1923, putting a live actor in a cartoon with the Alice comedies. In 1927, raising the bar for animated storytelling with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. In 1928, creating one of the first and by far the most innovative sound cartoons with Steamboat Willie. In 1929, dominating cinemas and merchandise around the world with Mickey Mouse. In 1932, creating the first full-color cartoon, Flowers and Trees. And in 1933, creating what's still the most successful cartoon of all time, Three Little Pigs. The Disney studio was cranking out one innovation after another, and Walt Disney had no plans to stop. In fact, quite the opposite. Walt was dreaming up his most ambitious idea yet, one that would combine all of the previous innovations to create something even bigger and better than he and his team had ever created before. Something so spectacular and revolutionary that it would change filmmaking forever.
From Hollywood comes the most exciting motion picture news of 1938. Walt Disney has completed and released his first full-length feature production, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in Technicolor, the most daring adventure in screen entertainment since the birth of the motion picture. As its credit titles, longest in cinema history, flash across the nation's screens, audiences for the first time realize the tremendous amount of manpower required for the production of this epoch-making animated picture. The entirely new form of storytelling that already has captivated every man, woman, and child who has seen it. Just how was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs created? And how are the famous Disney short films made? To give you the answer, we take you behind the closed doors of the famed Walt Disney Studio in Hollywood. Doors usually barred to all visitors.
Hello, extraordinary people. I'm Daniel, and today we're going to explore the creation of Walt Disney's first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. While it was not the first feature-length animated film ever made, as many mistakenly believe, there is a reason that so many people think that, and that's because Snow White changed everything. For Disney, for animation, for filmmaking, and for the world. But to truly understand how this happened, we have to start all the way back nearly a decade before Snow White was released, in 1928. Part 1. Silly Symphonies. Starting with the smash hit release of Steamboat Willie in 1928, Mickey Mouse had become a star and a household name. Adoring audiences all across the world could find Mickey in their local theaters starring in new adventures, on every type of merchandise imaginable, and in local Mickey Mouse clubs where fans would congregate and celebrate their shared love of the cartoon mouse. Before releasing Steamboat Willie, Walt Disney had been warned that cartoons were on their way out, that audiences were growing tired of them, and that making them was a waste of time. But with the enormous success of Mickey Mouse, Walt Disney had proven two things. Animation was here to stay, and no one would do it better than Walt Disney. To this end, Walt refused to be satisfied with the success of Mickey Mouse. He wanted new ideas. And the next big one was brought to him by Carl Stalling, the music composer of the Mickey Mouse series. Stalling suggested a series of shorts centered around music instead of a central character. The series would be an anthology, with a new cast of characters every time, and each cartoon would heavily feature a song or piece of instrumental music. Walt realized this idea was brilliant, as the focus on music would build on what had made Steamboat Willie great, the use of sound, and the lack of recurring characters would allow for far greater experimentation and range of stories than the Mickey Mouse cartoons would allow. Walt approved the idea, and the team set out to find an appropriate name. Stalling did not want the word music to be in the series title. believing it to be too generic and uninteresting. He instead suggested the title contain the word symphony, quote,
together with a humorous word.
Walt eventually got back to Stalling and asked,
Carl, how would Silly Symphony sound to you?
Stalling responded,
Perfect.
The first Silly Symphony was called The Skeleton Dance, and was pretty much exactly what the title suggests, centering on a group of dancing skeletons in a graveyard. There's no plot to be found. Rather, the cartoon focuses on creating atmosphere through creepy and surreal imagery. It was by far the most abstract cartoon Walt and his team had created thus far. The lead animator on The Skeleton Dance was Ub Iwerks, the co-creator and original animator of Mickey Mouse, and this cartoon is often considered his masterpiece. Disney's enthusiasm for The Skeleton Dance, however, was not shared by his distributor Pat Powers, who wrote back to Walt saying,
They don't want this. More mice.
A theater manager also reportedly called the short, quote,
too gruesome.
However, Walt was used to people not believing in his ideas, and released The Skeleton Dance anyway, trusting his audience to understand and appreciate what he was doing. They did. The Skeleton Dance was a financial success and officially launched the Silly Symphonies series.
I was right. Everything I say is right.
The series would go on to become so successful that other studios immediately started copying not just the concept, but even the name, with series such as Happy Harmonies, Merry Melodies, and one that I know no one will recognize, Looney Tunes. With the Silly Symphonies, Walt Disney demonstrated that animation could be high art, and he demanded, as he always had, that his employees turn in the best work possible. Walt personally had to okay every frame of animation that left his studio, and his artists found themselves constantly analyzing and reanalyzing their work until it was absolutely perfect. This was a direct contrast to other animation studios, which focused much more on quantity than quality. Walt's extremely high standards forced his team to come up with new innovations and techniques to deliver what Walt wanted. One such technique was the pencil test, in which animation in its roughest early state would be photographed on cheap negative film so the animators could make sure it looked good before working on it further. One animator named Tom Palmer figured out that the easiest way to view the pencil test footage was by using a moviola, a small device with a screen through which film could be viewed. When Walt saw this, he loved the idea, and installed a moviola in the studio for all his animators to use. This moviola was located in a small dark room nicknamed the Sweatbox, where Walt and his team would scrutinize every inch of animation until it was perfect.
I think it is astounding that we were the first group of animators, so far as I can learn, who ever had the chance to study their own work and correct its errors before it reached the screen. In our little studio on Hyperion Street, every foot of rough animation was projected on the screen for analysis, and every foot was drawn and redrawn until we could say, this is the best that we can do.
Walt Disney. Another of Walt's animators, Wilfred Jackson, built on the pencil test technique with what he called Leica reels. A Leica reel was a sequence of pencil tests, sometimes with sound added, that would allow the animators to essentially preview what entire sequences, or even the finished film, would look like early in development. This allowed Walt and the animators to analyze the footage and decide what needed to be upgraded or changed. Walt's desire for high-quality films didn't stop at the animation. What separated him from his rivals was not just the high technical quality of the animation itself, but the stories and characters being portrayed. All cartoons at the time, including Disney's, were focused on jokes, or gags as they were commonly referred to. A well-known foundational principle of storytelling is that everything, jokes included, works better when it involves characters and a story the audience cares about. One of the most basic ways to make the audience care about something, or find a joke funnier, is with setup and payoff. In other words, for the punchline of the joke to properly land as hard as it can, you have to actually set up and tell the joke first. This may seem obvious, especially when I say it like that, but it actually wasn't in the early years of animation. At least, not to anyone other than Walt Disney. Most cartoons at the time were a string of random gags involving a central character, and these gags weren't given much thought in the broader context of the cartoon. Disney animator Dick Huemer had worked for other studios before Disney and remembered that, quote,
"Our mistake was that we weren't establishing anything first. We were giving the payoff without the build-up. Disney always very carefully planned things so that everything was understandable, and one thing happened after another, logically."
Disney animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston also described the difference between the gags of the Disney studio and their rivals.
They were staged better with more care taken to establish the situation. There was more concern for detail, for building comedy, for making the gag pay off.
However, Walt wanted cartoons to be more than just gags, even if those gags were connected by a story. He wanted the story to come before the gags. This meant stories that audiences could emotionally connect to, and characters with actual personalities that could star in those stories. To that end, Walt did something no other animation studio had done at the time. He created a story department. This department initially consisted of 4 men. Ted Sears, a former animator who would lead the department, Bill Cottrell, who had previously worked in multiple roles for Disney, Webb Smith, who had worked in newspapers, and Pinto Colvig, who would go on to voice the character of Goofy, and who before working for Disney had led his own animation studio and actually created the first ever feature-length animated film. But more on that later. The story department would collectively work with the animators to develop the story of the cartoons, all meeting in a huge room to plot out each cartoon. The first innovation they created to make this easier was the storyboard, a sequence of rough drawings pinned to a corkboard, each representing a different scene or action. Essentially a script, but visually for animation. This allowed Walt, the animators, and the storymen to analyze, develop, and perfect the narrative flow of the cartoon before the much more involved work of animation began. Although many credit Webb Smith with the idea of the storyboard, some historians believe it was actually Ted Sears who came up with the concept, possibly even before he came to Disney. Walt continued to push his animators and storymen to create better and better cartoons, with an emphasis on realism and believability, or as it would later be described,
the plausible impossible. The plausible impossible means taking something that is against the laws of nature, something impossible, and making it appear rational and acceptable. In short, plausible.
Under this philosophy, animation had to follow a set of rules and have its own internal logic that made sense. It had to be close enough to reality to be believable. Gravity and weight had to be taken into account, as well as how things like hair and clothes would move with the characters. This was a direct departure from how animation had been done since the beginning, in a style now generally referred to as rubber hose animation. In rubber hose animation, the emphasis is on ease of drawing, and so characters' shape and volume will change as they move, as if they are made of rubber. For better and for worse, this style of animation creates a very goofy and exaggerated tone, which was the opposite of what Walt Disney wanted. He wanted his animation to feel real enough that his audience could form a strong emotional connection with what was happening on the screen. Walt started sending his animators to art classes, and even invited art professors and artists to teach in the studio. This included using live models for the animators to study, as well as slow-motion photography of things like glass breaking and water dripping, so the animators could perfectly match what it looked like. With this emphasis on high-quality animation and storytelling, the Walt Disney Studio quickly became the biggest in the world, and animators and animation students from all over the US started moving to California, all in the hopes of working for Walt Disney. But something was still missing from Walt Disney's cartoons. As early as 1930, Walt had been thinking about color and how to incorporate it into his cartoons, but he didn't think any of the existing processes were good enough. Color cartoons, and live-action films, were already being made using rudimentary Technicolor processes, which were referred to as Process 1, Process 2, and Process 3, in order of ascending sophistication. Process 3 was the most sophisticated, and is often inaccurately referred to as 2-strip Technicolor, to contrast it with the later 3-strip Technicolor, which I will discuss in a moment. Technicolor Process 3 was used in numerous live-action films, such as the 1930 Universal film King of Jazz, which coincidentally featured a cameo of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a character originally created by Disney. Process 3 was also used in numerous cartoons, such as the Flip the Frog series created by Ub Iwerks, the co-creator of Oswald and Mickey, who had left Disney in 1930 to start his own studio. Technicolor Process 3 arguably looked better than black and white, but it could only show colors that were in the red-green spectrum. Because of that, it wasn't good enough for Walt Disney, who opted to continue to produce his cartoons in black and white. However, in 1932, Technicolor developed Process 4, or 3-strip Technicolor, which would allow for a full range of color by simultaneously exposing 3 strips of film, which each recorded a different additive primary color, red, green, or blue. These 3 strips would then be combined to produce the final image. A full explanation of how the 3-strip Technicolor process works is far beyond the scope of this video, and could itself take up a video as long as this one. Suffice to say though, that it was an extremely complicated and involved, not to mention expensive process that was essentially impossible for live action at the time, and would really only work in animation. In fact, it was so cumbersome and expensive that no other animation studio wanted it, except of course, the Disney studio. Well, Walt wanted it. His brother Roy, who ran the business and financial side of the studio, vehemently disagreed. Producing cartoons in 3-strip Technicolor would be over 3 times more expensive, with no obvious way to recoup the costs. As United Artists, their current distributor, had no contractual obligation to pay more for color cartoons. The Disney studio would have to eat the cost and hope the cartoons were popular enough to cover it, which seemed unlikely. However, Walt believed that color would make the cartoons popular enough that they would pay off, and negotiated with Technicolor for a 2-year exclusive rights agreement so other studios couldn't use the technology.
Roy says color is going to cost us a lot of money that we'll never get back. So if we take a chance on it, you've got to assure us that every other cartoon producer isn't going to rush into the theaters with Technicolor.
Walt Disney. Technicolor agreed to Walt's terms, and this caused Roy to relent and agree to produce the next Silly Symphony in color. That cartoon was Flowers and Trees, which was already half done. While the animation itself didn't need to be redone, the inking and painting, as well as the backgrounds, need to be scrapped and redone in color. Inking and painting is the process of transferring animated characters from paper to transparent celluloid sheets called animation cells. This allows the characters to be animated over a background without the need to redraw the background for every frame. I'll explain the entire process of inking and painting, as well as animation itself, in much greater detail a bit later. Normal paint wouldn't work for animation, as it would chip and wouldn't stick to the cells. Walt and his team, therefore, had to develop entirely new paints to use for Flowers and Trees. Flowers and Trees was released on July 30th, 1932, and was an enormous commercial and critical success.
I was right, everything I say is right.
The cartoon went on to win the first ever Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film, or Best Short Subject Cartoons as the award was then called. Coincidentally, Walt Disney's Silly Symphonies would win every Academy Award in this category throughout the entire 1930s. With the success of Flowers and Trees, Walt decided that all Silly Symphonies going forward would be produced in color. This included what would become by far the most successful and famous Silly Symphony, 1933's Three Little Pigs. Three Little Pigs was the model student of the Silly Symphonies, the one that did everything right according to the established formula. It had a catchy and memorable song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
It had colorful and expressive animation. It had distinct and dynamic characters with fully realized personalities. It had funny gags. And perhaps most importantly, it had a timely message about the value of hard work that seemed to strongly resonate with Americans during the Great Depression, causing them to emotionally resonate with the story.
I'll be safe and you'll be sorry when the wolf comes to your door.
Three Little Pigs became a runaway success, and is still considered the most financially successful cartoon short ever released. The song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, was played on the radio so much that journalists started to complain that it was becoming annoying, beginning a tradition of people complaining about successful Disney songs that would continue to this day. Three Little Pigs of course went on to win the Academy Award for Best Short Subject Cartoons, and although the Silly Symphonies had been envisioned as standalone cartoons, United Artists, Disney's distributor at the time, demanded more, saying,
"Send us more pigs."
Walt initially refused, but Roy convinced him it would be an easy way to make some much needed extra cash. Three Little Pigs ended up getting 3 sequels, The Big Bad Wolf, Three Little Wolves, and The Practical Pig. However, these cartoons were not nearly as successful as the first, which led Walt to utter one of his most famous quotes.
"You can't top pigs with pigs,"
essentially reaffirming his commitment to originality.
I was right, everything I say is right.
The Disney studio continued to produce successful shorts in both the Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphonies series, as well as with new characters such as Donald Duck and Goofy. However, despite Walt Disney's monumental success and achievements in animation, he knew his studio had to move on to something bigger. There were 2 reasons for this. One was, of course, Walt's constant desire to reach new artistic heights and outdo his competition. and the other was far more pragmatic.
Money!
Walt's cartoon shorts were getting continually more expensive to produce, and they were already limited in how much revenue they could generate compared to the feature films they were playing in front of. Not to mention the fact that the United States was going through the Great Depression, and so movie theaters had seen a loss in business. Walt knew that in the long run, his studio could not survive only making cartoon shorts, no matter how good or popular they were. And while the main source of revenue for the studio was actually merchandise sales, that wouldn't be good enough either. They would need to create their own feature films. Part 2. Feature Animation. On October 30th, 1934, Walt Disney sent his animators out to dinner in a cafe across the street from the studio, and told them to return that evening for an important meeting. Upon their return, Walt invited them into the soundstage and had them sit in a semicircle. With only a single light bulb illuminating the room, Walt took the stage and for the next 3 hours, proceeded to act out his own version of the Brothers Grimm story Snow White, both narrating the story and performing each role. According to animator Ken Anderson,
he didn't just tell the story, he acted out each character. He would become the queen, he would become the dwarfs. He was an incredible actor, a born mime.
After finishing his performance, Walt announced,
"That's going to be our first feature."
The Walt Disney Studios now had before them their biggest, most ambitious challenge yet, creating a feature-length animated film. Contrary to popular belief, Walt Disney would not be the first to create a feature-length animated film, as there were already several in existence at this point. The very first, in fact, had been created by someone who is now working for Walt Disney, Pinto Colvig, a storyman who also provided the voice of Goofy and various other characters. In 1916, years before Walt Disney had even started work as an animator, Colvig had worked at a studio called Animated Film Corporation, and had directed a film called Creation, which is now considered to possibly be the first feature-length animated film ever created. Other than a few frames of animation that still survive, this film is lost, and almost nothing is known about it. It was likely mostly done in a cutout animation style, in which cardboard or paper figures are animated in stop motion, and it probably depicted a humorous rendition of the creation of the world. But other than that, there's almost no information about it available. We don't know how long it was, the details of its release, or whether or not it was successful with audiences. However, it's likely that it was not, as Animated Film Corporation would produce no more animated features, and the studio itself wouldn't last long either. The second animated feature film produced was called El Apostle, or The Apostle, and was produced in Argentina and released in 1917. This film was a satire of then Argentine President Hipólito Yrigoyen and was produced in the cutout style. Some believe that this was actually the first animated feature and that Creation was actually released later. Unfortunately, as Creation is lost, this is impossible to confirm. El Apostle is also sadly lost. The director of El Apostle, Quirino Cristiani, would go on to direct 2 more animated features in Argentina, again utilizing the cutout style. These films were Sin Dejar Rastros, or Without a Trace, released in 1918, and Peludopolis, or Peludo City, released in 1931. Both of these films are now lost. In 1924, an animated feature was produced in Chile titled Vida y Milagros de Don Fausto, or The Life and Miracles of Jiggs. Like its predecessors, this film utilized cutout animation and is now lost. However, in 1926, the first animated feature that still survives was produced, this time in Germany. This film is called Die Abenteuer des Prinzen Ahmed, or The Adventures of Prince Ahmed, and was produced in a silhouette version of the cutout animation style. It was essentially a cutout film, but instead of detailed figures, the characters were merely black silhouettes made from cardboard and lead. All of these films were produced and released before Walt Disney had even made the decision to create a feature-length animated film, and 3 more similar films would be released before Walt had released his.
A motion picture called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length feature animated production in cinema history.
You lie.
Today, many credit Walt Disney as creating the first feature-length animated film, and while that's obviously not correct, there is a logical reason people think this. The very few animated feature films of Walt's time were made in extremely basic and primitive styles, and were really more experimental or art house pieces than viable commercial entertainment. Most importantly, they were not what we think of as animated films today, and what Walt was proposing his studio create was something entirely different and new. An animated feature using pencil and paper cell animation, or traditional animation as we call it today. This was an extremely radical proposition for multiple reasons. First, it would be expensive. Traditional cell animation is an extremely arduous process that we'll discuss in more detail a bit later, but for now, let's just say that no one at the time thought any film could generate nearly enough revenue to cover the cost of an hour or two of traditional animation. Second, despite Walt Disney's best efforts, animation was not seen as a serious medium for storytelling, but rather only suitable for a few minutes of jokes or music. People loved cartoon shorts, but they would surely get bored or annoyed watching cartoon characters for an entire hour or two. It would simply be asking far too much of an average American audience. Third, creating a high-quality, feature-length, traditionally animated film would require new animation techniques and technologies that simply didn't exist yet. Walt Disney and his studio would have to spend far more money than they ever had before, train and push their artists to do things more difficult than they ever had before, invent new technologies more advanced than anything they ever had before, and convince a skeptical public to show up for something they never had before. All in all, it was an extremely risky proposition. But Walt not only knew it was necessary and believed it could work, he also had a plan for how to make it work, starting with the idea itself. Walt had tossed around multiple ideas for what story his first feature film would tell, and some of his friends and colleagues in Hollywood had also offered him ideas. One of these ideas was the Lewis Carroll classic Alice in Wonderland. Another idea was the Felix Salten novel Bambi: A Life in the Woods. Other suggestions included Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey and Gulliver's Travels. However, Walt would choose a different story from all of these suggestions. His first feature film would instead be based on the 1812 German fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, Snow White. Walt was already familiar with and fond of this story. At the age of 15, he had seen the 1916 film Snow White, starring Marguerite Clark as the title character. This film was itself adapted from a 1912 play called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which also starred Marguerite Clark. Walt Disney liked the name of this play so much that he bought the rights to the play simply so he could use the name for his feature film. In addition to Walt's fondness and nostalgia for Snow White, however, there were other more important reasons why he chose this story. It was a simple story with simple themes, and it was well suited to animation. In Walt's own words,
"As a kid, I had seen the story and liked it. The figures of the dwarves intrigued me. I thought it was a good plot, and it had broad appeal. It wasn't too fantastic. That's what you need. A fairly down-to-earth story that people can associate themselves with."
Walt Disney decided on Snow White as the subject of his feature sometime in mid-1934, after discussions with his story team and core animators, and made a formal press announcement in July of 1934. The first story concept for Snow White was written in a document simply titled Manuscript, which contained 21 pages of ideas that bore little resemblance to the finished film. These included Snow White traveling through such fanciful realms as Boogie Land, the Valley of the Dragons, and the Morass of Monsters. By October of 1934, Walt was holding weekly story meetings with his team, and most of these early ideas had been abandoned. On October 30th, once the basic story had been worked out, Walt made the announcement to the entire studio via his performance of the story, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs officially entered production. However, this start was slow. Walt Disney needed to rethink his entire production process for animation. The standard process was that each short was supervised by a director who was in turn supervised by Walt. Walt himself had originally been a director back when the studio was making only one or a few cartoons at a time, but he had not directed an individual cartoon since 1931's The Barnyard Broadcast, as his duties running the studio precluded him from focusing too much on any one project, and at this point, his studio was releasing around 20 or so cartoon shorts a year. However, Snow White was far more important than any cartoon short, and as Walt would be focusing almost his entire attention on his feature, the assumption was that he would be the one to personally direct it. In preparation for this, Walt took on directing duties for one of the silly symphonies, The Golden Touch, which told the story of the Greek myth of King Midas, a king who wishes that everything he touches would turn to gold. Apparently, another reason for his choice to direct this cartoon had to do with one of his top directors, Burt Gillett, who had directed Three Little Pigs. Gillett had left the Disney studio to work for Disney's competitor Van Buren Studios, and Walt wanted to demonstrate that he didn't need Gillett anyway, and could direct the cartoons himself. However, The Golden Touch was not a success with critics or audiences, and it seemed Walt had made the opposite point to what he intended. The Golden Touch soon became a way for Walt's employees to bring him down a notch, and in one argument when the short was brought up, Walt said,
Never, mention that picture again.
I was wrong.
Walt Disney would not direct Snow White himself, but would rather assign a director to work under him as he had with the cartoon shorts. This supervising director would oversee a team of sequence directors, who would each oversee a team to create each sequence of the film. They would all report to Walt. The top 3 candidates for this position of supervising director were David Hand, Wilfred Jackson, and Ben Sharpsteen, all successful directors of both Mickey Mouse shorts and Silly Symphonies. Other men who were considered were animator Harry Bailey and storyman Bill Cottrell. The role of supervising director of Snow White would ultimately be given to David Hand, who was likely picked for his organizational skills, something Walt Disney notably lacked, often going over his directors' heads and giving new instructions to the animators without keeping the directors in the loop. According to Hand,
the kind of man Walt was, you couldn't expect him to care anything about organization. And he didn't.
It therefore became Hand's job to ensure consistent communication and cooperation between all the different departments and teams, something that Hand excelled at. With Hand in the role of supervising director, Jackson, Sharpsteen, and Cottrell were each assigned the position of sequence director along with Perce Pierce and Larry Morey. This core team would lead the production of Snow White. Part 3. Creating Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. To create a traditionally animated film, there are several different steps that must be completed. These are story, recording, modeling and design, timing and layout, animation, inking and painting, and photography. Step 1. Story. The first step in creating Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was, of course, the story. Now you might think this step would be easy, as Snow White was being adapted from an already existing fairy tale. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, of the almost 4 years Snow White was in production, around 75% of that time was devoted to simply creating the story. Now, tracking down the original Grimm Brothers story of Snow White for this video, or at least the version Walt Disney would have been familiar with, was actually a lot more difficult than you might think. The story, originally in German and published in 1812, has been translated into English numerous times, and every translation seems to be different, with not only the wording of the text varying from translation to translation, but also details and entire story elements sometimes being very different across different versions. Even the name varies, as it's sometimes translated simply Snow White, and sometimes Little Snow White. In fact, this 2024 version I found at a local store has a quote on the cover that doesn't even match the text in the book itself. What's going on? Apparently, even the Brothers Grimm themselves changed the story in different publications throughout their lifetimes, and their story was itself based on earlier folktales. Ultimately, I was able to find 5 copies of the story for this video. First, the one I already mentioned is found in a Word Cloud Classics collection of Brothers Grimm fairy tales that was published in 2024 entitled Little Snow White. Second, I have a digital copy of the story titled Snow White that was published by HarperCollins in 2012. Third is a highly abridged and illustrated version published by Random House in 1996. Fourth is a version in a collection called The Children's Hour Favorite Fairy Tales published by Spencer Press in 1953. And finally, I was able to find a version titled Little Snow White in a collection of Grimm's fairy tales published by the A.L. Burt Company. This book unfortunately does not contain the year it was published, but there is a note written in the front cover that reads, Mary Lou Whitmer from Aunt Sue, 1933. This book was given as a gift from an aunt to her niece in 1933, the exact year that Walt Disney decided to adapt Snow White into a feature film. This is almost certainly the version that Walt would have read, and the story is as follows. The story opens with a queen pricking her finger on a needle while sewing next to a black-framed window while it snows outside. 3 drops of blood fall to the snowy ground, and the queen wishes for a child who is white as snow, red as blood, and black as the window frame. She soon gives birth to a girl who matches that description, Snow White, with lips as red as blood, hair as black as ebony, and skin as white as snow. And then the queen dies. Her husband, the king, remarries, and apparently dies as well because he's never mentioned in the story again. The new queen, Snow White's stepmother, is incredibly vain, and one day, when Snow White is 7, that's right, 7, the queen asks her magic mirror, "Oh mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And before you correct me and say that the line is actually magic mirror as it is in the film, in the book, the line is mirror, mirror. This is where the confusion around this line comes from. The mirror of course answers that Snow White, the 7-year-old, is the fairest in the land, and the queen becomes increasingly envious and angry at Snow White and decides to murder this literal child. The queen has a huntsman take Snow White into the forest to kill her, and demands he bring back her tongue and heart as proof of her death. The huntsman takes Snow White to the forest to kill her, but when Snow White begs for her life and pleads to be allowed to simply run away instead, the huntsman decides to let her go, hoping that the forest animals will eat her and thereby spare him the need to kill her himself. What a classy guy. He then kills a wild boar that conveniently happens to walk by at that very moment, and cuts out its tongue and heart to bring to the queen. The queen proceeds to then eat the tongue and heart that she thinks come from a 7-year-old child. This is a children's story, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. Meanwhile, Snow White runs horrified into the forest through thorns and wild animals until she eventually comes to a cottage. She goes inside and sees 7 places set at the table with food ready to be eaten and 7 beds. She eats a little off of each plate so that all 7 people will be equally mad, and then tries to sleep in the beds, all of which are the wrong size for her, except for the last one, which is just right. She then falls asleep, and the owners of the cottage, the 7 Dwarfs, return that night. We get a bit of a Goldilocks and the 3 Bears moment as the dwarfs say that someone's been sitting in their chair, eating from their plate, sleeping in their bed, etc. They eventually discover Snow White, and allow her to continue sleeping. The next morning, she wakes up and meets them, and tells them what happened to her. The dwarfs agree to let her stay, as long as she cooks, cleans, sews, and performs other stereotypically female domestic tasks. These grown men apparently need a 7-year-old to do this stuff for them. Snow White agrees, and the dwarfs warn her not to let anyone in the house while they're off at work in their mine, for fear that it might be the evil queen in disguise. The queen, meanwhile, asks her mirror again who's the fairest, and it says Snow White, along with her current location at the dwarf's cottage. The queen disguises herself as an old peddler woman, and goes to the dwarf's cottage to sell Snow White a silk stay, which is essentially a corset. Snow White is fooled by the disguise and buys the stay. The queen then puts the stay on Snow White and tightens it so much that Snow White can't breathe and passes out. The queen then leaves. The dwarfs find Snow White, cut the stay off, and are able to revive her. The dwarfs tell Snow White that it must have been the queen, and again warn Snow White not to let anyone in again. The queen again asks the mirror who the fairest is, it answers Snow White, and the queen again plots a murder attempt, this time with a poisoned comb and a different old peddler disguise. Snow White again falls for it, and the queen puts the comb in Snow White's hair, which knocks Snow White out. The dwarfs arrive back, remove the comb from Snow White's hair, revive her, warn her not to let anyone in, and the beat goes on. You'd think they'd start to notice a pattern here and maybe not leave her alone, but whatever. The queen goes through the same rigmarole with the mirror, and this time creates a poisoned apple with the outside poisoned and colored red, and the core unpoisoned. She dresses up in yet another old peddler disguise because apparently she has a closet full of them, and brings the apple to Snow White. This time, Snow White does not let her in the house, but the queen offers the apple for free, and after cutting it in half, takes a bite of the unpoisoned core to prove that it's safe. Snow White of course falls for this, takes the apple, and takes a bite of it. She then falls down dead. Not unconscious, dead. The queen returns to her castle, asks the mirror who the fairest is, and this time, it finally says what she wants to hear, telling her that she is the fairest in the land. I'm not joking. This is actually how the story goes. The dwarfs return home and find Snow White's dead body. After trying unsuccessfully to revive her, they cry for 3 days before placing the 3-day-old corpse of a 7-year-old child in a glass coffin so everyone can stare at it as it decomposes. The dwarfs then put her name on the coffin, along with the fact that she is the daughter of a king. They bring the coffin to the top of a mountain and have at least one dwarf stay by it at all times. The coffin stays there for a long time, but Snow White miraculously does not decay or decompose and retains her beauty. One day, eventually, a prince happens to travel by and sees the coffin. He offers to buy it from the dwarfs, what a classy guy, and they of course refuse. He then asks them to just give it to him, and they agree. He says he'll honor and protect her, so I guess that makes it okay. The prince has his servants carry the coffin, and as they're walking along, they trip and jostle the coffin, which dislodges the piece of apple that was apparently just stuck in Snow White's throat this whole time, which brings her back to life. Because that's apparently how poison and death work. Snow White wonders where she is, and the prince immediately announces his intention to marry her. She agrees, and the two are married. Remember, Snow White was 7 years old at the beginning of the story, and so either she was in that coffin for 11 years and survived somehow and matured to adulthood while asleep, or someone needs to call the police. Anyway, Snow White's stepmother, the queen, is invited to the wedding. and before leaving, she asks the mirror if she's still the fairest in the land, to which the mirror responds that the prince's bride is fairer. The queen is outraged and at first doesn't want to go to the wedding, but then decides to go anyway and see this young queen for herself. When the queen arrives, Snow White immediately recognizes her and has the guards bring out iron slippers that were heated up in preparation for the queen's arrival. The iron slippers are so hot that the guards have to carry them with tongs, and they make the queen put them on and dance until she dies. The end. I'm not kidding. That's actually where the story ends. There's no happily ever after, the queen just dies and the story abruptly ends.
The end.
So Walt Disney decided that this would be the perfect story to adapt for his first feature-length animated film. However, obviously, some things had to change. This film couldn't simply be a one-to-one adaptation from print to screen. Rather, Walt decided to use Snow White as a starting point to create a new story that was specifically designed for the medium of animation. Now Walt, of course, already had his version of the story roughly planned out, as he had already acted it out for his team. But that was only a rough rendition. Now Walt had to work with his story department to create the foundation of an animated film, and every detail had to be perfect. Since animation is a visual medium in which everything needs to be created from scratch by the artists, the story team didn't write a traditional screenplay like those used for live-action films. Instead, the story would be developed through story sketches, or drawings depicting the characters and ideas for the story the team was working on. These story sketches would be pinned to the board, analyzed, altered, upgraded, rearranged, or outright discarded until the best version of the story emerged. This was then refined into the film's storyboard, with every sequence, action, and shot planned out. The first step in creating the story was to create the characters. This involved naming the characters, designing how they would look and behave, and defining their individual personalities. Now, of course, the cast of characters in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs will essentially be the same as in the book, with one big exception: the titular Seven Dwarfs. These characters are unnamed in the book, and essentially function as one character. This would obviously not work in a film. Each dwarf would need to be an individual character with his own personality. It was decided that this would be done literally, with each dwarf's name being his dominant personality trait. The story team brainstormed dozens of possible names for the dwarfs, which included Dizzy, Crabby, Dirty, Blabby, Gabby, Silly, Sneezy Wheezy, Graspy, Daffy, Tearful, Busy, Wistful, Soulful, Awful, Snoopy, Hotsy, Jaunty, Lazy, Dippy, Biggie, Biggie Wiggy, Big O Ego, and Nerdsy? What the heck is Nerdsy? These aren't even real words anymore. More than 50 names total were brainstormed for the dwarfs, with some getting far closer to being included in the film than others. I have to assume that Nerdsy didn't last long, although Big O Ego actually did, eventually becoming Doc. The name that made it the furthest to being included in the film before being discarded was Deafy. Yes, Deafy. Deafy was, of course, a dwarf defined by his bad hearing and constant misunderstanding of what his fellow dwarfs are saying. The character, who definitely would not have aged poorly at all, was thankfully replaced by Sneezy around a year or so before Snow White was released. The final lineup of dwarfs consisted of Doc, Grumpy, Bashful, Happy, Sneezy, Sleepy, and Dopey. The dwarfs would all be distinguished visually by color and appearance, as well as their different personalities. Doc was the leader of the group, and his dominant traits would be his self-importance and his mixing up of his words, a common gag in 1930s radio shows. Grumpy would be a grouchy dwarf who would gradually warm up to Snow White as the story progressed. Happy would be more of a supporting character, defined by his cheerfulness and optimism. Sleepy was mostly a vehicle for gags, constantly falling asleep, but an early concept featured him actually being the smartest in the group when he was awake. Bashful was a shy dwarf who was secretly a hopeless romantic. Sneezy was another mostly comic relief character, always sneezing at the worst possible moment. Finally, Dopey was the odd one out of the dwarfs, and the most visually distinct, with no beard, oversized clothes, and a childlike appearance. Eventually, the decision was also made that this character would not speak. While the dwarfs themselves were fairly cartoony and similar to other characters Disney had created, the rest of the main cast of Snow White were all human characters who had to be designed with a degree of realism. starting and most importantly with Snow White herself, whose appearance was largely designed by artist Grim Natwick. Snow White would go through multiple character designs, and an early outline describes her as a, quote, Janet Gaynor type, 14 years old. Side note, if you've ever read those clickbaity internet articles claiming that Snow White is 14, an age that would make her relationship with the prince non-consensual, this early outline of the character is where that age comes from. However, I don't think this necessarily means that the character in the film is meant to be 14. Snow White's character design would change dramatically between this early outline and her final appearance in the film, in which her age is, of course, never mentioned. So, was Snow White actually 14 in the film? And if so, is it wrong to enjoy the film knowing that it depicts something extremely problematic? Well, in my opinion, the answers to these questions respectively are probably not and no, but you're presumably an adult, and so you can answer those questions for yourself. So much on the subject of Snow White's age. Other early descriptions of the main characters include the Queen, a mixture of Lady Macbeth and the Big Bad Wolf. Her beauty is sinister, mature, plenty of curves. She becomes ugly and menacing when scheming and mixing her poisons. Magic fluids transform her into an old witch-like hag. Her dialogue and action are overdramatic, verging on the ridiculous. The Huntsman, a minor character, big and tough, 40 years old. The Queen's trusted henchman, but hasn't the heart to murder an innocent girl. Magic Mirror, the Queen's unwilling slave. Its mask-like face appears when invoked. It speaks in weird voice. The Prince, Doug Fairbanks type, 18 years old. And that rounded out the cast of characters. In addition to the changes the characters underwent, the story itself changed multiple times as well, and eventually became very different from the original fairy tale. The biggest changes were simply to streamline the story and remove anything unnecessary that would slow the plot or action down. This meant that the Queen's 3 attempts to kill Snow White were shortened to just 1. The Queen's death also happens immediately after this attempt, allowing the emotional focus at the end of the film to be on Snow White's reawakening. The Prince is also more of a character in the film, which is shocking to say given how minor his role still is, but he's introduced at the beginning of the story to allow a romantic connection to form between him and Snow White. There are also many smaller changes, especially to the weirder and more bizarre aspects of the book, such as Snow White being more of a teenager or young adult than the young child she is in the book, her lips being described as red as the rose rather than red as blood, the Huntsman being a far more sympathetic character, just the heart of the pig being brought to the Queen rather than its tongue and heart, and the Queen simply putting the heart in a box rather than eating it. Perhaps the most noteworthy change was in Snow White's revival being from the prince giving her love's first kiss, which breaks a magic spell created by the apple, rather than the truly ridiculous ending of the book. There were also several elaborate sequences that were planned for the film but were ultimately cut. One of these was a dream sequence that would have featured Snow White and the Prince sailing through the sky on a swan-shaped boat before dancing among the stars. Although this scene was cut, its ideas would be reused for the 1938 silly symphony Winkin', Blinkin' and Nod. Most of these story changes came from Walt Disney himself, who essentially dictated the story to the story team and whose revisions of their work went down to the smallest detail. Walt didn't credit himself as part of the story team, but he was arguably the principal author. The credited story team for Snow White is as follows: Ted Sears, the head of the story department, Richard Creedon, Otto Englander, Dick Rickard, Earl Hurd, Merrill Damaris, Dorothy Ann Blank, and Webb Smith. You may have noticed that one of the credited writers, Dorothy Ann Blank, is a woman. While animation studios at the time, including Disney, were segregated by gender, with women being mostly relegated to roles in the ink and paint department, which we'll discuss later, and not allowed in the much more prestigious animation department, which we'll also discuss later, the story department was one area that both men and women worked in. Walt Disney felt that a, quote, woman's angle was needed for his productions, and thus made a point to include women in his story team.
Women are the best judges of anything we turn out. Their taste is very important. They are the theater goers. They are the ones who drag the men in. If the women like it, to heck with the men.
Walt Disney. Dorothy Ann Blank was the third woman hired to the story team at Disney, and would become one of the key writers for Snow White, as well as helping to develop the process of story research for Disney, which is the process by which stories are chosen to be adapted to feature films. Walt also focused heavily on the development of quality jokes or gags for Snow White. The film had to have mass appeal, and so, in addition to connecting with audiences emotionally, at the very least, it had to make them laugh. Walt was so determined to make the movie as funny as possible that he instituted a $5 a gag policy for anyone in the studio, regardless of position, who could come up with a joke that made it into the final film. $5 in the 1930s was just over $100 today. The last important part of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs story was the inclusion of songs and music, essentially making it a feature-length silly symphony. And that brings us to the next step of creating an animated film. Step 2. Recording. Before a sequence from the storyboard could be animated, all the sound and music had to be recorded first, so the animators could animate to the recording and have everything in perfect synchronization. I'll expound on how that worked a little later. The sound for the film can be divided into 3 categories: music, voice acting, and sound effects. The music itself consists of the songs and the instrumental score, which often borrowed melodies and motifs from the songs themselves. The songs for Snow White were composed by Frank Churchill with lyrics by Churchill and Larry Morey. Frank Churchill had joined Disney in 1930, and among other notable work, had written the hit song Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf from Three Little Pigs. The instrumental score for Snow White was composed by Paul J. Smith and Lee Harline. As the story changed throughout Snow White's development, so did the music. Initially, the music in Snow White was similar to the musical films of the time, in which songs were interspersed throughout the film with little connection to the story. The common thinking at the time was that people came to a musical film to hear the songs, and so the story didn't really matter. Walt fundamentally disagreed with this approach, telling his composers,
"We should set a new pattern, a new way to use music. Weave it into the story so somebody just doesn't burst into song."
A symphony orchestra records the musical score, the hit tunes that will thrill listeners the world over.
Equally as important as the music were the actors who would provide the voices for the characters, especially Snow White. Over 150 actors auditioned for the role of Snow White. However, they did not audition for Walt, at least not directly. Walt wanted to judge the actors only by the quality of their voice, and not let any bias seep in. In Walt's own words,
"I didn't want to be thrown by looking at the person, because I only wanted their voice."
Instead, Walt would sit in his office next to the soundstage where the auditions were held. The actors would speak and sing into a microphone that, unbeknownst to them, went to a speaker in Walt's office. Walt wouldn't be told whose voices he was hearing. He only had a number to identify them. In between each audition, the talent scout conducting the auditions would call Walt on the phone and ask what he thought of each voice. Walt continually turned them down, holding out for his perfect Snow White. Eventually, though, Walt heard exactly the voice he wanted. That voice belonged to Adriana Castellotti, the daughter of a well-known vocal coach. This helped explain why she was able to reach the dainty, higher-pitched voice that Walt wanted, which was surprisingly difficult. In Castellotti's own words,
"It's not my normal voice. I had to push it up to get that Never Neverland quality Mr. Disney was looking for."
Castellotti recorded her parts for Snow White in only a few days.
I really feel quite happy now. I'm sure I'll get along somehow.
The dwarfs' voices were almost as important as Snow White's. Each dwarf's voice would have to perfectly match their personality. Since Doc's speaking and word mix-up were inspired by radio, it only made sense to have a radio personality voice him. That actor would be Roy Atwell, who in addition to being a popular radio star, had already voiced a similar character to Doc in a cartoon series called Ramblin' Round Radio Row.
Careful, man. Search every hook and granny, search everywhere.
Grumpy would be voiced by Pinto Colvig, who is already an established voice actor for Disney whose credits included Goofy and Practical Pig from Three Little Pigs.
Mark my words, there's trouble a-brewing.
Happy would be performed by Otis Harlan, a veteran stage actor since 1887 and film actor since 1915, who had appeared in over 100 films.
Happy, ma'am. That's me. And this is Dopey. He don't talk none.
Sleepy was originally to be voiced by Sterling Holloway, who would later become a regular Disney voice actor, but ultimately Sleepy would be voiced by Pinto Colvig.
Maybe the old queen's got Snow White.
Scotty Matraw provided the voice of Bashful.
Oh, gosh.
And Billy Gilbert was given the role of Sneezy.
Take him away. By dose. By hay fever. You know I can't stand it. I can't.
Dopey, of course, had no voice actor as the character didn't speak. The prince was slightly more difficult to cast than the dwarfs. And after auditioning various actors, Walt Disney and his team chose actor and singer Harry Stockwell.
Hello. Did I frighten you?
One of the most important voices would be the voice of the evil queen, the villain of the story. This character would have 2 voices, the voice of the queen herself, and a different voice when she disguises herself as the old hag. The voices needed to be provided by the same actor in order to maintain continuity, and so an actor who could perform both was required. The actor who was eventually chosen was Lucille Laverne, a veteran of both the stage and screen, who embodied the characters so perfectly that Walt Disney at one point remarked,
"All the dialogue sounded bad to me until she read it."
Snow White lies dead in the forest. Now turn red to tempt Snow White to make her hunger for a bite. Have a bite?
The final two characters with speaking roles were the Magic Mirror and the Huntsman. The Magic Mirror was particularly difficult to cast, as the voice not only had to sound deep and ominous, but also otherworldly, or as Walt described it,
suspended in nothing.
The role eventually went to Moroni Olson, who was known for playing the Musketeer Porthos in the 1935 version of The Three Musketeers. However, his deep voice would not be enough to sell the character, and so the sound department had him record his voice through either a tube or a specially designed box, according to different sources. Whichever device, or both, was used, it gave his voice the perfect echo and reverberation to achieve the desired effect.
What wouldst thou know, my queen?
The Huntsman was the most minor character in the film, but his voice was more important than you might think, as his reactions to being asked to kill Snow White were critical to the film's emotional power. After unsuccessfully attempting to find an actor to play this role, the casting director, Paul Stewart Buchanan, simply played the part himself.
But your majesty, the little princess!
In addition to the voices and music, Snow White would also require numerous sound effects. These sound effects had to be recorded from scratch by the studio, and were created by utilizing various devices and contraptions designed specifically to create certain sounds. For example, a glass bottle was tapped to produce the sounds of the dwarf's pickaxes hitting diamonds. The head of the sound effects department was Jim McDonald, who would eventually take over for Walt Disney as the voice of Mickey Mouse. McDonald often performed many of the sound effects himself, and would write a score for the sound effects similar to a music score in which the sound effects would be performed at exactly the right time to match up with the animation. McDonald had become adept at this, as he was a former drummer and had an impeccable sense of timing. This was critical, as it wasn't really possible at the time to add in specific sound effects individually like filmmakers can do today. Some mixing and separate recording was possible, but for the most part, the sound for any individual sequence had to all be recorded at once. This meant that the musicians and sound effects crew would all be in the same room and record all their parts in sequence just as they would sound in the finished film. Any mistake would mean the entire session would have to be scrapped and started over. Step 3. Modeling and design. Throughout the development of the story, the characters and visuals would need to be designed and perfected to what they would look like on the screen. While creating the initial storyboards and story sketches, concept art and rough ideas would be utilized, but these would have to be updated into designs that were far more detailed and sophisticated, and that could concretely form the basis of an animated film. The visual design of an animated film can broadly be separated into two categories: the characters that populate the story, and the environments or backgrounds in which the story takes place. The main difference between these two from the artist's perspective is that the backgrounds and environments are stationary, and therefore only need to be drawn and painted once or a few times, whereas the characters must be drawn and painted thousands of times to create the illusion of movement. In order to create a character that can be animated, a character model must be created. This was the job of the character model department, headed by Joe Grant. A character model is essentially the final design of the character that would be used in the film. The first step in this process was creating a model sheet, or a collection of drawings of the character from different angles in different poses. These model sheets would then be given to sculptors, who would create three-dimensional clay sculptures of the characters that would be cast into plaster versions called maquettes, and then painted and given to the animators. These maquettes would provide a visual reference to the animators and allow them to see what the character would look like from any angle.
I don't suppose you got something here for about $1.50 that holds tobacco.
Silly, they're not for sale.
Well, if they're not for sale, what are they for? Or am I too young to know?
We make them up for the artist to give them an idea of what each character looks like from every angle. Then everybody will make him the same, see?
It sounds like a very smart idea.
As for the visual design of the backgrounds in the film in general, Walt wanted Snow White to be a work of art in every sense. In addition to the art classes that were already being taught in the studio, Walt encouraged his artists to watch live-action films and ballets for inspiration. Horror films such as Nosferatu and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde ended up being a large influence on Snow White, as did Gothic films such as Metropolis. Walt Disney's main goal for the visuals of Snow White was that they have the look and feel of a European storybook, and the lavishness and detail of European art. Two of the major artists who provided this to Walt were Albert Herder, a Swiss artist who supervised the backgrounds and environments of the film, and Gustav Tenggren, a Swedish artist who provided extensive concept art that would define the look of the film. The backgrounds were painted in watercolors to give the film a soft fairy tale-esque aesthetic, similar to the illustrations one would find in a storybook or to classical European paintings. Once the characters and backgrounds were designed, the film could then advance to the next stage of development. Step 4. Timing and layout. Once the story is finished, the sound is recorded, and the visual design of the film is complete, the basic setup of the film can then be constructed. This setup of the film is called the layout, which is created by a team of layout artists. For Snow White, this team was led by artists Hugh Hennessy and Charles Philippi. The layout team constructs essentially a guide map for the film, with each shot, action, and edit planned out in sequence, with instructions for the animators on what action and camera movement should take place. The layout is similar to a storyboard, but far more precise and detailed. The importance of this step is to determine if things like editing, camera placement, staging of characters, and so forth will work to their full potential before the excruciating and painstaking work of animation can begin. This severely reduced the amount of animation that would theoretically have to be redone or discarded, which is critical given the amount of time and work that animation takes. These layouts also determine the size of the characters in relation to each other. One of the most important parts of the layout was timing, or the concept of matching the animation to the recorded sound. This was done through the use of exposure sheets, which would have a graph of the soundtrack and the frames of animation, marking where the animation would need to have certain actions or movements to match the sound and music. This way, everything could be perfectly matched up without having to waste too much film on test footage. One of the challenges faced by the layout team was the field size for animation. The field size was the size of the paper the animation was created on. The standard for cartoon shorts was 9.5 by 12 inches, but this would not be big enough for Snow White, which required numerous characters to all be on screen at once, as well as long tracking shots. Thus, a much larger field size had to be created, and all equipment adapted to accommodate it. Once the layout is complete, animation of the film itself can begin. Step 5. Animation. Perhaps the most important step in creating an animated film is, unsurprisingly, the animation itself. Animation at its core is the same basic concept as live-action film, a series of still images that when played in rapid succession, create the illusion of motion. Live-action film is created by taking an extremely quick series of still photographs of a moving subject. Let me demonstrate. This is a 1946 Bell & Howell 16mm film camera that's operated by a hand crank. When I crank the camera, film is advanced through it, and a rotating shutter exposes each frame of film as it passes behind the lens. Each click you hear is an individual photograph, or it would be if there were actually any film in the camera. These photographs are then fed through a projector at a rate of 24 pictures or frames per second. Your brain interprets this as movement, and we have a moving picture, or a movie for short. Animation is the same principle, but instead of photographs of live action, animation is created with photographs of a still subject, such as a drawing or stop-motion figurine. The still subject is manipulated between photographs to create the illusion of motion. This is how all animation works, whether it's this stop-motion Lego video I created for my first ever YouTube channel, or the 2007 computer-animated film Elf Bowling, which is a real movie that exists. Traditional animation is created by a series of hand-drawn pictures using a pencil and paper. The paper is placed on a light table which shines light through the paper, allowing the animator to see through it. The animator draws the first picture, then puts another piece of paper on top of it and traces the picture underneath, changing it only a little bit. The animator then repeats this process until all of the drawings of the sequence are completed. These drawings can then be photographed or simply flipped through to create the illusion of a moving image. Thus, in animation, every single frame must be drawn individually in order to create what looks to the human eye as convincing movement. At the standard rate of 24 frames a second, a 1-minute long animation requires 1,440 individual drawings. An hour of animation requires 86,400 drawings. Creating a feature-length animated film, therefore, is a gargantuan task that requires an army of animators. And as with any army, This number has to be divided up into various ranks and categories. For Snow White, the top rank, of course, was Walt Disney himself, the studio head and producer. Every frame of animation had to be inspected and approved by Walt, otherwise it had to be redone. Operating below Walt was the supervising director, David Hand. Hand would supervise a team of sequence directors, Wilfred Jackson, Ben Sharpstein, Perce Pierce, Larry Morey, and William Cottrell. If Walt Disney approved the animation they brought to him, then they had done their job correctly. If not, they would have to do it over. The film's layout was divided up into 31 separate sequences, and each man was assigned several of these sequences to oversee, with his own unit of animators to create each sequence. These animators were again divided into several categories. Supervising animators, who would oversee individual characters, actions, or scenes. Key animators, who would draw key poses, or the poses that were the most important to any action or sequence. In-betweeners, who would fill in the animation between the key poses. And assistant or cleanup animators, who would refine or fix the drawings when necessary. These were not necessarily set roles, and animators could perform multiple roles as needed. For instance, the supervising animators often did the key animation themselves, and sometimes even animated whole sequences. In addition to this, characters and scenes respectively would also have their own units working on them, and so there was a lot of crossover between who was assigned to work on what. To create their animation, each animator was given a handout by the sequence director. This handout contained a copy of the layout of the scene they would be working on, a copy of the film's storyboard so they could see how their scene fit into the overall story, a tape or record of the soundtrack of their scene, an exposure sheet that matched the timing of the soundtrack to the frames of animation so everything could match up perfectly, and maquettes of the characters the animator would be animating. Additionally, live actors would also be used as reference points for the animation, but I'll discuss this more in a bit. Animators are often described as actors with pencils, since they are creating and performing a character and must do so in a way that emotionally connects with the audience, just like an actor. Thus, just as actors compete with each other to be able to play the best roles, the Disney animators for Snow White all wanted the chance to animate the leading characters. However, Snow White would require animation of a quality far beyond anything the Disney studio had created up to that point, and so only the absolute best animators would be qualified to handle the leading characters, or rather, to learn how. That's because what was required to animate Snow White had never been done before, and that is believable human animation. A brief discussion about human animation. Human characters have always been a staple of animation going back as far as the medium has existed. The first film ever to utilize animation was a 1900 short film by James Stewart Blackton called The Enchanted Drawing, which featured a human face on an easel that would change expressions as Blackton interacted with it. The first proper animated film, also by Blackton, was called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, and also featured human characters, if we can call them that. The first proper animated character, with a name and a unique design, was also a human, Little Nemo, created by Winsor McCay and adapted from McCay's comic series Little Nemo in Slumberland. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, human characters in animation outnumbered animal characters, until the massive popularity of Felix the Cat eventually made cartoon animals the norm going into the 1930s. Most of Walt Disney's earliest animations, such as the Laughograms, also featured human characters. However, at the end of the day, all of these human characters were really no different from the animal characters. They looked like cartoons, they moved like cartoons, and whether the character was supposed to be a cat, mouse, or a human was almost beside the point. At the end of the day, they were all cartoon characters. The only way to depict a realistic and believable human on film was through live action. One notable early attempt to bridge the gap between animation and live action was the Out of the Inkwell series by Max Fleischer, which featured a clown character who would later be named Coco. Coco's movements were eerily similar to actual human movement, such that they almost violently clashed with the other animated characters that Coco interacted with. There was a good reason for this. Coco's movements were not just similar to real human movement. They were real human movement. Coco's animation was created using a device called a rotoscope, which Max Fleischer's studio had created specifically for this character. A rotoscope is essentially a projector that can project a film one frame at a time onto the back of an animator's workspace. By filming his brother Dave in a clown suit, and then projecting that film onto his animation paper and tracing over it, Max Fleischer was able to create realistic human animation. This process of tracing over a film of an actual human to create an animation is now called rotoscoping. Obviously, the animation of Coco the Clown looked very realistic. What it didn't look was good. To understand why, we have to understand a concept that's fundamental to the artistic depiction of human characters, the uncanny valley. As a drawing, animation, or other artistic depiction of a human character becomes more realistic and human-like, whether in the look, behavior, movement, or anything else, the emotional connection of an audience to that character becomes stronger, up to a certain point. Between that point and the point of complete realism, a human character will seem off, weird, or downright creepy. Essentially, if a character is almost, but not quite, completely realistic and human-like, they are in the uncanny valley. This is why the characters in the 2004 motion capture film The Polar Express look so bad. They're close to being completely realistic, but they aren't close enough, and so they end up looking creepy and disturbing instead of warm and inviting. Coco the Clown also falls into the uncanny valley. His movements are perfectly realistic, but he's a cartoon clown. His movements are too realistic for his otherwise cartoony design, and thus detract from his overall emotional or comedic appeal. This is the reason that rotoscoping never really caught on in animation, and it also perfectly illustrates the challenge that Walt Disney and his animators would face in creating Snow White. Snow White had to feel human in order to emotionally connect with the audience on a deep enough level to sustain a feature-length film. This required Snow White to be more realistic than any cartoon human character before her, but she couldn't be too realistic. She had to approach the uncanny valley as close as possible without actually entering it. Additionally, Snow White would of course also need the usual hallmarks of a great animated character: personality and appeal. Personality is what makes an animated character stand out and be unique. Appeal is what makes him interesting and memorable. It is impossible to understate how important to the success of Snow White the film Snow White the character was. If the Disney studio got it right, it would make the film. If they didn't, it would break it. Thus, Walt Disney's choice of who would animate Snow White, the character and the film, was of paramount importance. Walt's first step in assigning animators to Snow White was to assign 4 supervising animators who would be in charge of overseeing all of the animation department for the film. These 4 were Hamilton Lusk, Fred Moore, Vladimir or Bill Teitla, and Norm Ferguson. However, just because they were overseeing the animation in general didn't mean that the 4 supervising animators wouldn't be doing any animation work themselves. Quite the opposite, in fact. Hamilton Lusk, or Ham as he was commonly known around the studio, would be selected by Walt as the lead animator for Snow White, the character. Lusk was an extremely accomplished animator who had risen to the highest ranks of the Walt Disney Studio, having worked on major characters in some of the most popular silly symphonies, such as Max Hare in The Tortoise and the Hare and Jenny Wren in Who Killed Cock Robin. To prepare Lusk for the task of animating Snow White, Walt Disney assigned him, along with Les Clark, another top animator, to animate the character of Persephone in the silly symphony The Goddess of Spring. This short was specifically created to test how well the animators could create a realistic human character. The Goddess of Spring was essentially a test run for Snow White. The results were not great. While it's clear to see that an admirable effort was put in, the character is simply not convincing on the screen. Walt, however, was optimistic and said,
"We'll get it next time."
Lusk was therefore assigned to animate Snow White, but he would not be working alone on the character. The other principal animator of Snow White would be Grim Natwick, who was a newcomer to the studio, hired specifically to work on the film. Natwick's career had been defined by animating female characters for multiple different animation studios, most notably Betty Boop for Fleischer Studios, a character that Natwick had created. To test how well Natwick could animate a realistic human character, Walt assigned him to work on a silly symphony called The Cookie Carnival, which featured a cookie girl who was given a makeover to look like a much more realistic human woman. Unlike Lusk, who had shown potential with The Goddess of Spring, but had ultimately fallen short, Natwick nailed his assignment, impressing Walt with his smooth, expressive, and believably human-like animation of the cookie girl. Natwick was assigned to work under Lusk, and had his own unit of animators within Lusk's unit to work on animating Snow White. In order to animate Snow White realistically, Lusk and his animators had live-action reference models who were filmed performing the scenes in the studio. Most of this live-action reference was performed by Marjorie Belker, a teenage professional dancer whose father, Ernest Belker, ran a dance school in Hollywood. Lusk's unit utilized rotoscoping of the live-action footage to assist in creating the animation for Snow White, but the animators did not simply trace over the footage like Max Fleischer had done with Coco the Clown. In fact, that idea was insulting to Disney's animators, who considered their skills to be above such crude techniques. Instead, the rotoscoped footage was used as a reference to allow the animators to incorporate the parts that worked for an animated character and leave out the parts that didn't, thus ensuring that Snow White captured the essence of live-action movement without falling into the uncanny valley. With this approach, Lusk and his team conquered the human animation problem and found the perfect balance between live action and animation. While Snow White was a challenging character to animate, the other characters were equally as important and came with their own challenges. The dwarfs in particular were challenging for their need to have 7 distinctive personalities that would essentially always be on screen at once, each standing out from the others while still feeling like a semi-cohesive group. Bill Titla and Fred Moore would be in charge of the dwarfs, with Titla himself handling much of the animation of Doc and Grumpy, and Moore being the lead for Dopey. However, the dwarfs were animated by multiple different artists in total, who each worked on multiple different scenes featuring them. Every artist and team handling each character and scene had to constantly communicate with the others to ensure consistency between scenes, so the characters and their personalities would feel the same no matter who was animating them. As difficult as Snow White and the dwarfs were for the animators to realize, the most challenging character was undoubtedly the prince. In addition to going through multiple changes in the story phase, the prince is notoriously controversial among the artists as to how he would be portrayed. Would he be playful and comedic, or a completely serious and sincere character? Eventually it was decided that the answer would be the latter, but the artists didn't have experience animating a realistic male human character, especially one with no comedic or cartoonish elements that the audience would need to take completely seriously as a romantic interest for Snow White. The prince's role in the film was scaled back considerably to where he only appeared in a few scenes, but this didn't make the task of animating him easier, and it took an entire team of animators to finally bring him to the screen satisfactorily. Grim Natwick led this effort and did most of the animation of the prince that ended up in the film, with assistance from Mark Davis, who would eventually become one of Disney's top animators and Imagineers. The rest of the prince's animation was done by Hamilton Lusk's unit, and perhaps most notably by a junior animator named Milt Kahl, who was part of the team assigned to animate Snow White's animal friends. Kahl started as a cleanup artist on some of the prince's scenes, but his work was so good that he was promoted to full animator. Kahl would go on to become one of Disney's most high-ranking and influential animators, developing techniques so advanced that no one else could master them, and by the end of his career, and still to this day in my opinion, he was probably the best animator to ever work in the art form. Another of Disney's best animators was Art Babbitt, who was assigned to work on The Evil Queen, who required a subtly cold and menacing personality which contrasted sharply to how she would be portrayed when she transformed into the old hag, which was a much more exaggerated and cartoonish character. This version of the Queen was animated by Norm Ferguson. The Magic Mirror was animated by Wolfgang Reitherman, another future top animator at Disney, and the Huntsman, the most minor and easiest to animate of the 4 human characters, was animated by Errol Gray, a member of Ham Lusk's unit. The only other characters in the film were Snow White's animal friends, comprised of various deer, birds, rabbits, squirrels, and other animals. Because these characters interacted with Snow White so much, they were animated by a subunit within Ham Lusk's unit, and the principal animal animators were Jim Algar, Bernard Garbett, Milt Kahl, Eric Larson, and Louis Schmid. Somewhat similarly to the human characters, the animals were drawn to be similar to their real-world counterparts, but still cartoony enough to work in a fairy tale setting. Because animation is so time-consuming and work-intensive, the goal was for no sequence or aspect of the story to make it to the animation phase unless it was 100% confirmed to make it into the final film. However, there were 2 notable exceptions for Snow White: a scene in which the dwarfs sing a song while eating soup that Snow White has prepared for them, and a scene in which the dwarfs build a bed for Snow White. These scenes were almost completely animated when Walt made the decision to cut them from the film because they were slowing down the action of the story. Ward Kimball, who had animated both of these scenes, was so distraught to see so much of his hard work be discarded that he almost quit working for Disney. Walt convinced him to stay by promising that he could animate one of the main characters of the studio's next feature. When the animation of any particular scene was completed, it would consist of thousands of uncolored pencil and paper drawings that were organized in the correct sequence. These drawings would then be sent to the next department in the process, the ink and paint department. Step 6. Inking and painting. Despite traditionally animated films commonly being thought of as pencil and paper, what you see on screen is not the creation of the animators, at least not directly. Instead, it's the creation of the ink and paint department. This department was responsible for the final setup of the film before it was given to the photography department to be photographed. In the early days of animation, what was photographed and seen in the finished film was the pencil and paper animation itself. This meant that the entire drawing, including the character, background, props, and everything else would have to be redrawn from scratch for every single frame. This was obviously extremely time-consuming and inefficient. If the background wouldn't change throughout the scene, then why not figure out a way to have to draw it only once? In 1914, an animator named Earl Hurd invented a solution to this problem. If that name sounds familiar, it's because I've already mentioned him in this video, as one of the credited members of Snow White's story team. After the failure of his own studio, Hurd was hired by Walt Disney as the storyboard artist. However, Hurd's biggest contribution to animation would be his invention of the ink and paint process. Instead of drawing everything on one sheet of paper, Hurd would draw the background on one sheet of paper, and then draw the character and anything else that needed to move on a transparent sheet of celluloid. He would lay the celluloid sheet, or cell for short, over the background to be photographed. This severely cut down the amount of work that was required, and it soon became the industry standard. What would also become standard was that inking and painting was primarily performed by women and was seen as women's work. A full explanation of why this was the case, especially during a time when women working at all was unusual and even looked down upon, is far beyond the scope of this video. In fact, many at the time didn't even understand it. Walt Disney was actually asked about this in a magazine interview in 1935, and this is what he had to say.
Very frequently, they are better artists than men, but for some reason, they lack the knack of getting smooth action into their drawings.
This was actually a pretty progressive view for the time, especially since the general view was that men and women had completely different skill sets and roles they could be good at, and that women's were entirely related to homekeeping and child rearing. However, there were some jobs, such as telephone operators, secretaries, and stenographers, that became broadly seen as jobs for women, and inking and painting was one of these. Again, this is a huge topic, but suffice to say that despite being an essential part of the animation process that required the talents of hundreds of skilled artists, inking and painting was often regarded as a secondary or even trivial part of the industry simply because it was being performed by women. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The first step of inking and painting is the inking part. Inking is the initial tracing of the pencil and paper drawing onto an animation cell. However, it's more than just tracing the drawing. There's an element of artistic interpretation as well. The inkers had to understand the finer points of the animation in order to reproduce the drawings with the personality and feeling intact. According to animator Ward Kimball,
those inkers had to be really good. They weren't just tracing the animator's drawings, they had to get the feeling of the animator's pencil lines too.
Painter Ruthie Thompson put it this way.
I don't know whether the inkers get enough acclaim or not, but they are artists, all of them. And they have to be. The animators were always complaining for fear that they wouldn't get all their action in, and they'd miss it by a squirt of hair or something like that. So the inkers, the ones who could do it beautifully, were the ones that should get a little more praise.
Painting was the process of then coloring in the ink drawing. This was far more complicated than it might seem. First of all, lighting, texture, shading, dimension, and movement were all expressed through color. Not only that, but all of it had to be perfectly consistent. If even one frame wasn't inked or painted perfectly, it could ruin the entire sequence. This meant that the hundreds of ink and paint artists all had to produce the same quality of work across the tens of thousands of cells that would be inked and painted for Snow White. However, so far I've only really scratched the surface of what the ink and paint department was responsible for. They had to develop the paints themselves in hundreds of different colors, since full-color animation had been pioneered by Disney and was a completely new industry. Everything had to be created in-house. Furthermore, the ink and paint department was also in charge of creating special effects for the animation, such as motion lines, shadows, underwater effects, reflections, smoke, and twinkling stars. Walt Disney's perfectionism applied just as much to ink and paint as it did to every other step of the process. Anything that wasn't absolutely perfect had to be sent back and redone. The head of the ink and paint department during the production of Snow White was Hazel Sewell, who had led the department for Disney as far back as 1927 when Disney was producing the Oswald the Lucky Rabbit shorts, which predated Mickey Mouse by a year. This made Sewell the first woman to lead a major division of an animation studio. To create the colors for Snow White, Sewell's ink and paint department would need to completely change their approach from the work they had done on the Silly Symphonies and Mickey Mouse shorts. While those had been done in exclusively brighter, more vibrant colors, Snow White would require colors that were subtler and more subdued in addition to the brighter colors. The color had to help convey not only the personalities of the characters, but the story itself. While the ink and paint department had used 435 different colors for the cartoon shorts, they increased that number to 1,500 colors for Snow White. Just as with the animation, color tests were performed to see which colors would look the best. Initially, the dwarfs were to wear light pinkish colored clothes, but paint supervisor Dot Smith argued that their colors should be darker. Snow White was colored in lighter colors to stand out from the backgrounds, while her hair and face were given highlights and subtle detailing to give her dimension and definition. One of the most challenging aspects of Snow White's coloring was her cheeks. They needed a rouge-like pink so she wouldn't look pale, but it had to be subtle enough to look realistic. According to a popular story, the painters used actual rouge to achieve the effect. As told by animator Frank Thomas,
she had no color in her cheeks, so they tried painting color on there, which made her look like a clown. One of the girls said,
Walt, can we try putting a little rouge on her cheeks?
He said,
What do you mean?
So she took out her makeup kit and put some rouge on the cell, and it looked keen. Walt said,
Yeah, but how the hell are we going to get it in the same place every day, and on each drawing?
And the girl said,
What do you think we've been doing all our lives?
He said,
You mean to tell me that you can put that in the same place on the girl's face, no matter how she turns?
They just knew where it ought to go, and without any kind of guide, they made Snow White up on each cell. So there's this lovely little tint on there. That's how much we cared.
There's only one problem with this story. It's not true. The painters tried multiple different approaches to coloring Snow White's cheeks, including rouge, but none of them worked. They would have to invent an entirely new paint and process. In the summer of 1937, mere months before the planned release of Snow White, the Paint Lab, which was run by a painter named Mary Weiser, finally figured out a solution. Literally. They invented a transparent stain solution that contained red and orange pigments. While the paint was usually applied to the back of the cell, this solution was applied to the front, where it would dissolve and absorb into the cell, creating a subtle warmth that was barely discernible. As with the rest of the paint, it had to be applied perfectly, and there were few painters who could do it correctly. One of the best was Helen Auger, who ended up doing a majority of this rouge application for Snow White. Similarly to the fake story, the women who were the best were the ones who were the best at putting rouge on themselves. This technique was called the blend, and was utilized not only for Snow White, but also for other characters such as the dwarfs to give them more texture and dimension. A version of it also gave the animals a more realistic fur texture and clothing-specific textures such as linen or satin. Once inking and painting of a scene is complete, that scene can then go on to the final step, photography. Step 7. Photography. The final step of creating an animated film is photography, in which the scenes are photographed and the film is developed and edited into the final film. The standard setup for photographing animation was to have a desk with bars at the top and bottom and metal pegs sticking out of it. The backgrounds and animation cells had holes punched in them at exact locations to match the pegs, so that they could be placed in exactly the same spot every time. This was called peg registration, and ensured that the animation was perfectly smooth with no jittering or unplanned movement. First, the background is placed on the desk, then all the cells for the animation. A compressed air mechanism would then lower a glass plate to flatten the cells into the background and remove any wrinkles. Just in case this chipped or rubbed the paint, which could happen occasionally, ink and paint artists would be on standby to correct the problem if necessary. A 35mm Bell & Howell camera locked in place to the desk would then take one photograph of the setup. The process was then repeated. After doing this 24 times, 1 second of animation was produced. With this process, a standard short cartoon took about 100 hours to photograph.
The pre-feature cartoon camera was fairly simple in construction and operation, and generally very satisfactory. Here, a Mickey Mouse short is being put on film. Mickey has been inked and painted on transparent sheets of celluloid. Photographing each one of these celluloids of Mickey and background makes a single frame of motion picture film.
Despite this camera system being the standard for all animation studios, including Disney, it wouldn't be good enough for Snow White. The reason for this was that it was incapable of producing an illusion of depth, and made everything look flat and two-dimensional. This was fine for cartoon shorts, which utilized limited locations and weren't long enough for anyone to care about more technical details. But Snow White was a feature-length film requiring bigger locations, establishing shots, tracking shots, and much more camera movement and sophisticated visuals than any of the cartoon shorts. For example, when Snow White runs through the forest, Walt Disney wanted it to feel like she was actually surrounded by trees and not just running in front of a flat background. Or when establishing shots slowly zooms in on the castle, Walt wanted it to look like the castle was actually in the distance. Perhaps the most glaring limitation of their current camera setup, however, was regarding the appearance of the moon in nighttime shots. If you zoom the camera in on a nighttime scene where the moon is visible, the moon will grow at the same rate as the other objects on the horizon. This is obviously not realistic, as the moon is so far away that it would always appear the same size. A realistic scene would have the moon stay the same size while the objects on the horizon get bigger. To solve this problem, Walt and his team developed the multiplane camera, which was an enormous setup of multiple levels or planes, hence the name, with the camera stationed on top. Each plane contained different aspects of the background which could be moved independently of each other, combining to create an image with depth.
The different elements in the scene were separated according to their varying distances from the viewer. This put the moon on a plane farthest away from the camera. With our original picture broken down in this manner, It is possible to control the relative speed with which each individual part of it moves to or away from the camera.
The multiplane camera took 4 years to develop and required up to 8 operators. It was also much slower than the normal camera setup, only able to produce about a fifth as much footage a day as the typical procedure. However, the images produced by the multiplane camera were stunning and far beyond anything that could be produced before.
And here now is our same moonlight scene the way the multiplane camera sees it. As you can see, we finally got the moon to keep its proper distance.
To test out the effect, the studio created the silly symphony The Old Mill, which was released on November 5th, 1937, mere weeks before Snow White's planned release date on December 21st, 1937. This short was not only a test of the multiplane camera, but also of numerous other special effects and techniques for Snow White, such as rain, wind, lightning, and the creation of an emotional response in the audience simply through use of the animated environments without the use of characters. Whereas previous test silly symphonies such as The Guise of Spring had failed to fully realize their innovations, The Old Mill was an absolute success, and easily ranks among the best of the silly symphonies. In addition to the animation that makes up the majority of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 2 live-action sequences were also filmed. These sequences feature a storybook that opens and closes to start and end the film. Part 4. Production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now hold on a minute, you may be saying right now. Didn't you just spend an excruciatingly long time describing the production of Snow White? Well, yes and no. I've described the process by which the film was created, but what I haven't discussed yet is the overall production, or rather, how Walt Disney was able to make it all happen. Now, when I described all the different aspects of animation production, I did so separately, but what is imperative to understand is that all of these departments were working at the same time in constant communication with each other, and all under the supervision of Walt Disney. Walt Disney's role in the production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is best described like this.
The musicians play their instruments. I play the orchestra.
So let's go back to the beginning and look at how it all happened together. After Walt's performance of the story of Snow White for his studio on October 30th, 1934, the studio started to work on the story for the film, and Walt started to hire and train new animators for the film. These new animators would spend the first several weeks exclusively in art and animation classes for 8 hours a day before being assigned as in-betweeners and taking classes every week. In fact, everyone in the studio was required to take weekly classes. By November 1935, Walt felt that his studio was ready to start work on Snow White, and started to assign everyone their positions and sequences to work on. However, the production soon became chaotic. As I mentioned earlier, animators and animation units would be assigned to a character or a scene. However, characters appear in scenes, and scenes contain characters. If an animator was working on a character, he would have to communicate with the other animators for each scene to make sure that his animation fit into the scene and all the other characters in action that was happening. Would the characters interact properly? Would the animation match up? Etc. On the other hand, if an animator was animating an entire scene, he would have to communicate with the rest of the animators to make sure the scene kept continuity with the other scenes. Did the characters look, move, and behave the same way? Etc. Walt was utilizing both approaches, requiring constant back and forth in multiple directions. Additionally, by 1936, when animation was well underway, it became clear that the studio did not have enough animators to carry the entire workload. Walt would need around 300 or so new artists, and he would need them fast, as the planned release date of Snow White was constantly being pushed back. Walt sent 2 men, Don Graham, who was teaching many of the classes at the studio, and George Drake, who was assisting with some of the classes, to New York to recruit these new animators. After 4 months, $15,000, and 2,000 applications, they returned with 22 new animators. Their standards were just that high for how good they wanted these new recruits to be. These new animators were trained under George Drake, who was known for being a tyrant with an explosive temper. This was in contrast to the last group of recruits, who had trained under Don Graham and Disney's veteran animators like Hamilton Luske, Fred Moore, and Norm Ferguson. This group of new animators had included such men as Wolfgang Reitherman, Eric Larson, Ward Kimball, Milt Kahl, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, John Lounsbury, and Mark Davis, who would go on to be 8 of Disney's 9 old men, or core group of animators throughout the 1950s up to the 1980s. The 9th old man was Les Clark, who had been with Disney since the 1920s and the Oswald shorts. This group of animators had not had to suffer under the iron fist of George Drake, but the new group would. As a result, many of them didn't last long at the studio, despite only having to train under Drake for 1 month. However, in spite of this, animators and other industry artists and workers from all over the world were trying their hardest to get a job working for Disney. Not only was Walt Disney producing the best animation in the industry and constantly innovating, but there was a palpable excitement and camaraderie to working at the studio. However, there was a significant problem. There wasn't enough space. Disney was still operating out of the same studio, known as the Hyperion Studio due to its location on Hyperion Avenue, that had been utilized since the Oswald shorts. This studio was plenty big enough for producing shorts, but not nearly big enough for the production of a feature film. With all the new talent coming in and the increasing workload to create Snow White, the studio had to expand, and new land was purchased and buildings constructed on it, including new animation buildings, projection rooms, offices, and a new ink and paint building. By the time the construction was complete, the studio consisted of 12 buildings across 5 acres. However, this still wasn't enough, and the studio had to rent out other nearby buildings as well. By this point, the entire staff of the Walt Disney Studio was over 600 people, but production of Snow White continued to crawl at a snail's pace, with deadlines constantly being pushed back and every aspect of the work being scrutinized and redone until it was perfect. Walt had announced that Snow White would release in December of 1937, but by the summer of that year, the studio was majorly behind schedule and massively over budget. Roy had taken out several loans at this point, and when he went to the bank asking for another, he was told that someone from the bank would need to see their progress on Snow White. They needed reassurance that their money was being well spent. Early in September, the banker in charge of Disney's account, Joe Rosenberg, visited the Disney studio to watch a rough cut of the film. If he was pleased with what he saw, he would go back to the bank and tell them to approve the loan, and production of Snow White could be completed. If not, then the loan would be declined, and the Disney studio would not be able to complete Snow White and would have to declare bankruptcy. Walt Disney was the only one in the room with Rosenberg to watch the rough cut of Snow White, and as much of the film hadn't been animated or colored in yet, Walt had to explain what would go in the unfinished parts, or act out the parts that were still just storyboards. As Walt fought to hide his anxiety and sell the film as much as he could, Rosenberg barely reacted, only briefly nodding or verbally acknowledging Walt's explanations. As the screening ended and the lights came back on, Walt couldn't tell what Rosenberg had thought of Snow White. Walt walked Rosenberg out to his car to leave, and Rosenberg talked about Roy, the weather, and seemingly anything but the film he had just watched. Rosenberg got into his car and said goodbye, and then just before driving off he added,
"That thing is going to make you a hat full of money."
At least, that's how Walt remembered it. It's likely that this story, as many of Walt's stories were, was embellished. Walt and Rosenberg were likely not the only two in the room, as Disney had recently ended their partnership with their last distributor, United Artists, and made a deal with RKO Radio Pictures to distribute not only Disney's cartoon shorts, but also Snow White. The RKO executives, including studio head Ned Deppinett, were also shown the rough cut of Snow White, almost certainly at the same time as Rosenberg. At any rate, the RKO executives loved the film and made a distribution deal with Disney, and the bank approved the loan. With funding and distribution now secured, the Disney studio could finally complete Snow White. However, the December deadline was fast approaching, and the studio was still behind schedule. Everyone had to work overtime, literally and figuratively, to get it done, working long hours including weekends and late into the night to get the film completed. Walt continued his perfectionist scrutinizing of his artist's work, but as the deadline approached, he realized he would have to ease up, whether he liked it or not. Finally, on December 1st, just 20 days before the planned release, Snow White's final photography was completed. The last scenes to be photographed were the final scenes in the film, in which Snow White falls into the sleeping death and is reawakened by the prince. As Walt and Roy watched the footage, though, they noticed a massive problem. As the prince walks towards Snow White's glass coffin, he shimmies and shakes. The problem was from the peg registration of the prince's painted cells. In the rush to finish the scene, the celluloid sheets had been washed and reused too many times, and the holes where the pegs would hold the cell in place had become enlarged, causing the cells to move from where they were supposed to sit. With each frame of the prince's animation being slightly off, the result was that the prince shimmied and shook as he walked. Walt wanted to fix the mistake, but it would require them to redo the whole scene at a six-figure cost. Roy, who had reluctantly gone along with Walt's perfectionism and extravagant spending throughout the entire production of Snow White, finally put his foot down saying,
"Forget it. Let the prince shimmy."
Walt knew he had no choice, and relented. However, even if he couldn't fix this mistake, Walt would make sure the film would be as perfect as possible, and continued to have his artist tweak and perfect it. By this point, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had already been previewed as a rough cut several times by audiences, most of them the artists and employees of the Disney studio. Walt would take note of their reactions to the film, and make small changes or cuts to parts that didn't elicit the response he wanted. For example, the scene where the dwarfs mourn Snow White's death was originally a much longer scene, with several of the dwarfs reacting to Snow White's death. But test audiences laughed at what was supposed to be the most emotional part of the film. Walt realized that subtlety was the key to this scene and cut it down. After these screenings, the employees were encouraged to write notes expressing their thoughts on the unfinished film. One of these notes simply said,
"Stick to shorts."
Walt was so annoyed by this note that for years after, whenever someone didn't like one of his ideas, Walt would say,
"I'll bet you're the guy who wrote Stick to Shorts."
On December 6th, Walt Disney and several of his employees took a rough cut of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to the Fox Theater in Pomona, California for the first sneak preview of the film to the public. The audience's reaction to the rough cut was positive, and Walt returned to his studio to finish the film in time for the premiere that was only 2 weeks away. Finally, on December 17th, 1937, a mere 4 days before its scheduled premiere, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Walt Disney Studios' first feature-length animated film, was finally complete. Part 5. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
The picture that every newspaper and magazine critic is raving about. Hear what the usually hard-boiled reviewer of Time magazine says. Snow White is as exciting as a Western, as funny as a haywire comedy. It combines the classic idiom of folklore drama with rollicking comic strip humor. It is an authentic masterpiece. More than 250,000 paintings like these were created by Walt Disney and his staff of artists to make the most daring adventure in the history of motion pictures, with new and amazing characters. Snow White, warm, human, the lovable Seven Dwarfs. But let Walt Disney tell you about them himself.
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities. This pompous-looking individual is Doc, the self-appointed leader of the group. And this little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White. And this funny face is Sneezy. He has hay fever. And old Droopy Eyes is called Sleepy. And Happy here with the beaming smile. And old Sourpuss here is Grumpy, the woman hater. And last but not least is Dopey. He's nice, but sort of silly.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opens with the title and credits sequence, typical of movies of the time. Also typical of movies of the time, the credits only list those considered the top people, including the story writers, animators, background artists, and musicians. In fact, the top people from all the different departments seem to be included, with one notable exception. No points for guessing what that department is, or why it wasn't included. However, the opening sequence also includes a message from Walt personally thanking his artists for their work, so that's nice. The movie itself opens with a live-action sequence of a storybook opening and letting the audience read the first 2 pages of the story, which introduce Snow White and her stepmother, the Queen, who is jealous of Snow White's beauty. The Queen asks her magic mirror daily who the fairest one of all is, and as long as the mirror answers that it's the Queen, then Snow White is safe. This live-action segment quickly and efficiently gets all the exposition out of the way so the animated film itself can get right into the action. The animated film itself then opens with a multiplane camera shot of the Queen's castle, which fades into a closer shot, which fades into an interior shot of the Queen approaching the magic mirror. In a brilliant shot of just the Queen's reflection in the mirror, we see her summon the slave in the magic mirror. With a flash of lightning and fire, the slave appears. The Queen says the line,
"Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?"
And the mirror responds that there is one who is more fair than the Queen. The Queen demands to know who it is, and the mirror reveals that it's Snow White.
Lips red as the rose, hair black as ebony, skin white as snow.
Snow White.
We then meet Snow White, who is cleaning the steps to the castle and humming while she does so. She goes to draw water from a well, and some doves land on the well next to her. Snow White tells them through song that the well is a wishing well, and subsequently wishes for her true love to find her.
Make a wish into the well, your wish will soon come true.
As she sings, a prince who is riding his horse outside the castle hears her song and climbs over the castle wall to see who the singer is. As Snow White sings into the well and her voice echoes back, we get a brilliant shot from inside the well up at Snow White. This shot is especially impressive for 1937, when shots like this couldn't really be done in live action. A distortion glass is also used in this shot to simulate the distortion of the water. The prince sees Snow White and walks up to introduce himself to her, but Snow White is startled and runs off into the castle. The prince starts to sing a love song to her, and Snow White peeps out the window and quickly becomes enchanted with him and walks out onto the balcony.
I have but one song, constant and true.
Unbeknownst to them, the queen watches as well. As the prince's song ends, Snow White sends him a kiss via a dove. Next, we see the queen sitting on an elaborate peacock-shaped throne, giving commands to her huntsman to take Snow White out into the forest and kill her. The huntsman is shocked by this command and protests, but the queen quickly shuts him down and he reluctantly agrees. The queen then tells him to bring Snow White's heart back in a box to confirm that he did it. The huntsman takes Snow White out to the forest where she picks flowers while singing the prince's love song. She finds a little lost bird, and as she comforts it, the huntsman sneaks up behind her and draws his dagger. Snow White sends the bird off, and as she says goodbye, the huntsman raises the dagger to kill her. Snow White sees him and screams in horror, but he drops the knife and begs Snow White to forgive him. The huntsman quickly explains what's going on and tells Snow White to run away so the queen will never find her.
Run! Run away! Hide! In the woods, anywhere! Go! Go!
Terrified and overwhelmed, Snow White runs into the woods, which seem to come alive around her, with branches becoming hands and grabbing at her, logs turning into crocodiles, and the trees themselves transforming into horrifying monsters. Snow White eventually collapses on the ground and starts crying, and we see that it was all in her imagination. The forest animals gather around to investigate, and Snow White sings a song with them to cheer herself up.
With a smile and a song.
She then asks them if they know somewhere she can stay, and they bring her to a cottage in the woods.
I like it here.
Snow White rubs away the fog on the window, utilizing a brilliant ink and paint effect, and looks in the window to see that it's dark inside.
It's dark inside.
She knocks on the door, but no one answers. She invites herself in and sees that there are 7 little chairs, which she takes to mean that 7 little children must live here.
Why, there's 7 little chairs. Must be 7 little children.
She sees that the house is extremely dirty and messy, and deduces, or rather induces, that the children must be orphans.
Maybe they have no mother. Then they're orphans.
She decides to clean the house for them and see if they'll let her stay. She and the forest animals clean the house and sing a song while they do so.
Just whistle while you work.
We then see the owners of the house, the Seven Dwarfs, working in their mine collecting naturally occurring perfectly cut and sparkling gems and singing a song about their work.
In a mine! In a mine!
They then leave to go home and sing one of the catchiest songs ever written.
Hi-ho! Hi-ho! It's home from work we go!
Meanwhile, Snow White goes to see what's upstairs and sees 7 beds with the names of the owners on them. Doc, Happy, Sneezy, Dopey, Bashful, Grumpy, and Sleepy. Snow White starts feeling a little sleepy herself.
I'm a little sleepy myself.
And so she lies down in the beds and goes to sleep along with all of the forest animals. However, the animals hear the dwarfs approaching.
Hi-ho! Hi-ho!
Doc notices that the light's lit,
The light's lit!
and the dwarfs realize that someone is in their house. They sneak into the house and notice that everything has been cleaned.
Look! The floor! It's been swept!
The dwarfs are suspicious that whoever is in their house is a witch or a ghost, and some birds decide to mess with them by making noise and scaring them. The dwarfs decide the noise is coming from upstairs and send Dopey to investigate.
We're right behind you.
Yes, right behind you.
Dopey sees Snow White stretching under a white sheet and thinks she's a ghost. He runs downstairs, but the other dwarfs think he's the monster and run outside the house, holding the door shut so he can't get out. Dopey rips the handle out of the door and stumbles backwards into a pile of pots and pans, running outside with the pots and pans all over him, making him look like a monster. The other dwarfs attack him until they realize who it is. Dopey essentially tells them that the monster is asleep in their beds, and the dwarfs decide to kill it before it wakes up. They sneak into the bedroom and are shocked at the true identity of the monster.
What is it?
Why, it's a girl!
The dwarfs all think she's beautiful except for Grumpy, who doesn't trust women.
She's a female. and all females is poison.
Snow White wakes up and sees the dwarfs and guesses all their names before introducing herself.
Oh, you must be grumpy.
Doc tries to express his honor at being in the presence of a princess, but Grumpy tries to get Doc to send her away. Snow White says that if they do, the queen will kill her, and the dwarfs reveal that they are already fully aware of the queen's evil and magic powers, with Grumpy warning the others that if Snow White stays, the queen might kill them all.
She can even make herself invisible. I'd be in this room right now.
Snow White says the queen doesn't know where she is, and if the dwarfs let her stay, she'll clean and cook for them. Upon hearing that Snow White can cook, the dwarfs, except for Grumpy, excitedly let her stay. Snow White rushes downstairs to get her pot of soup off the fire and tells the dwarfs that before they can eat it, they'll need to wash up, which takes some convincing.
March straight outside and wash, or you'll not get a bite to eat.
They eventually go outside to wash, with Grumpy stubbornly being the last to go, but then sitting on a barrel with no intention of actually washing.
Courage, men. Courage. Don't be nervous.
Gosh, it's wet.
Doc shows the dwarfs how to wash while singing a song, except for Grumpy, who looks on with contempt.
Get your hands full of water. You snort and you snuff and go.
You make me sick going.
After the other dwarfs are done washing, Grumpy sarcastically says he'd love to see anyone try to make him wash if he didn't want to.
I'd like to see anybody make me wash if I didn't wanna.
And the other dwarfs then grab him and make him wash.
Get him! Let us good, let us all, let us good, let us high below.
Snow White calls him for dinner and the scene ends. Back at the Queen's castle, the Queen again asks the mirror who the fairest is. The mirror answers that Snow White, who now lives with the Seven Dwarfs, is the fairest. The Queen shows the mirror the box where Snow White's heart supposedly is, and the mirror tells the Queen that the box holds the heart of a pig.
The heart of a pig! And I've been tricked.
The Queen angrily goes down to her dungeon, plotting to kill Snow White herself. She brews a magic potion to transform herself into an old hag as a disguise.
Now, begin thy magic spell.
She drinks the potion, and in one of the more surreal and effects-heavy sequences of the film, she transforms into the hag.
Look! My hands! A perfect disguise.
The Queen then finds a spell for a poisoned apple that will put the victim into
the sleeping den.
Back at the dwarf's cottage, the dwarfs play instruments, dance, and sing a silly song for Snow White, who claps and sings along. Even Grumpy grumpily participates, playing an elaborate organ.
Oh, hum, the tuli's dumb, the worst of being a thing. It's a silly song for anyone to sing.
Snow White gets up to dance with the dwarfs, and Dopey gets on Sneezy's shoulders to dance with Snow White on her level, wearing a very long coat that the dwarfs apparently just had lying around waiting for just such an opportunity. The two dance with Snow White until Sneezy sneezes so hard that it blasts Dopey into the ceiling rafters. The song then ends, and the dwarfs ask Snow White to tell them a story.
What shall I do?
Tell us a story.
Yes, tell us a story.
Snow White tells them the story of how she met the prince, and sings a song about how she wishes to one day marry him.
Someday my prince will come.
With all the dwarfs enthralled by the story and song, except for Grumpy, who dismisses it as
mush.
Snow White finishes the song and realizes that it's late and they should get to bed. Doc says that Snow White can sleep in their beds, and all the dwarfs agree except for Grumpy, who has mostly given up arguing with the others at this point.
You're sure you'll be comfortable?
Oh, yes. Very comfortable.
Snow White goes up to bed, and as soon as she closes the door, the dwarfs immediately start fighting over where to sleep.
Pleasant dreams.
Pleasant dreams.
Snow White prays before going to bed, and asks God to make Grumpy like her.
Oh, yes. And please make Grumpy like me.
The dwarfs all end up sleeping in whatever humorous place they can find, including one of my personal favorite jokes in the film, in which Sneezy sleeps on Dopey's bottom, including fluffing it up like a pillow. Meanwhile, the evil queen brews the poison for the poisoned apple, and checks the spell book to make sure there isn't an antidote.
But wait,
may be an antidote.
She looks through the book and finds out that the antidote to the sleeping death is love's first kiss. However, she scoffs at this, saying that the dwarves will think Snow White is dead and bury her alive.
She'll be buried alive!
The queen descends deeper into her dungeon, passing and mocking a skeleton of one of her victims before boarding a small boat and using a punting pole to sail the boat down the river. She then sets off into the forest. The next morning, as the dwarves leave to work in their mine, Doc warns Snow White that the queen is crafty and not to trust strangers in case they may be the queen in disguise. Snow White says she'll be alright and says goodbye to each of the dwarfs, kissing them on the head.
Goodbye.
Oh, God.
After all the other dwarfs say goodbye, Grumpy comes out, takes off his hat, and tells Snow White not to let anyone in the house. Snow White says,
Why, Grumpy, you do care.
Before kissing him on the head, which Grumpy feigns protest to before laying his guard down and accidentally revealing his affection for Snow White. He then angrily walks off as Snow White waves goodbye to him. The queen in disguise then approaches the house and passes two vultures who fly after her, hoping to feast on her victim. Snow White bakes a pie for Grumpy with the help of her forest friends, and is surprised to see the queen looking in the window at her. The queen gets Snow White to reveal that she's alone before offering her the apple. Just before Snow White takes a bite, the forest animals attack the queen, knowing who she really is. Snow White reprimands them and takes the queen inside. The animals then run off to get the dwarfs. They arrive at the dwarfs' mine and start to try to get the dwarfs to come with them, but the dwarfs don't understand what's going on and try to get the animals to stop. Meanwhile, the queen tells Snow White that the apple is a magic wishing apple, and one bite will make her dreams come true. The dwarfs keep fighting back against the animals until Sleepy sleepily says,
Maybe the old queen's got Snow White.
The dwarfs realize that he's right and start panicking. Grumpy immediately takes charge and jumps on a deer to ride back and save Snow White. The other dwarfs quickly follow suit. As the dwarfs and animals stampede back to the cottage, Snow White falls for the queen's trick. She takes the apple, makes a wish, and takes a bite.
Don't let the wish grow cold.
Snow White then collapses to the floor, and the queen laughs maniacally as it starts to rain.
He perished in the land.
Before seeing the dwarfs galloping towards her. The queen runs off and the dwarfs give chase as a thunderstorm ensues. The queen runs up a rocky mountainside and the dwarfs continue to follow her. The queen reaches a cliffside and realizes she's been cornered, but then tries to dislodge a massive boulder and roll it down the hill at the dwarfs. However, before she can do this, lightning strikes the ledge the queen is standing on, sending her falling off the cliff with the boulder falling after her. The vultures then circle down after her. We fade to the dwarfs holding vigil for Snow White, all crying over her loss, including Grumpy, who hides his face in his hand. A text card then tells us that the dwarfs couldn't find it in their hearts to bury her, and instead put her in a glass coffin. The prince hears of this, and comes to visit and say his goodbye to Snow White. The dwarfs have continued to hold vigil by her side, and the prince walks up to Snow White, kisses her, and kneels down to grieve. However, Snow White then wakes up and the prince takes her in his arms as the dwarfs all rejoice. The prince puts Snow White on his horse, and she says goodbye to all the dwarfs, including Grumpy.
Bye, Grumpy.
The prince then takes Snow White to his castle, which appears to be glowing and sitting on a cloud, as the film ends with a triumphant musical chorus. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs isn't just a masterpiece. It's practically the masterpiece. By the standards of animation in 1937, even though set by Disney with the silly Symphonies, it was completely new and thrillingly innovative. The amount of detail and painstaking effort put into every aspect of the film, from the story to the animation to the inking and painting and everywhere in between, was quite literally unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The film is breathtakingly lavish, with beautifully painted backgrounds, gorgeous multiplane shots, intricate attention to detail with effects like running water, wind, moving clouds, smoke, and distortion, and painterly and innovative shot composition that goes far beyond what live-action films could do at the time. There are so many examples of gorgeous shot composition and brilliant cinematography that I couldn't possibly list all of them, but my favorite example is probably in the wishing well scene when the camera is placed in the well looking up at Snow White, with water distortion as if the camera is underwater. No one else is doing anything even close to this in animation or live action. The character animation is also pitch perfect, striking the perfect balance between realism and fantasy, with nothing feeling jarring or out of place, and the colors are lush and vibrant, creating an immersive and enchanting fairy tale setting. In addition to the visuals, the music is not only powerfully emotional and moving, but it perfectly accents every action on screen. The songs are also instantly memorable and perfectly integrated into the story, while simultaneously standing on their own as great pieces of music. Walt Disney's $5 a gag policy also really paid off, with the film being full of memorable visual jokes and hilarious moments. But the appeal of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs goes far beyond its painstaking visuals, humor, music, or technological innovations. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is, at its core, a simple and universally appealing story about the power of good over evil, the importance of moral character over physical beauty, the destructive power of jealousy, and the ultimately redemptive power of true love and kindness. The characters are far more rich and complex than you might think, especially the dwarfs, who despite being named after their dominant personality traits, exhibit complex personalities and character growth throughout the film. The film is also expertly written and paced, with every scene being important to the plot or character development, and everything in the film working together beautifully with one unified vision to perfectly guide the audience through the emotions of the story. When Snow White runs scared through the forest, we're scared too. When she sings about her prince, we wish for them to be together as much as she does. When she dies, we cry over her loss, and when she is awakened, we rejoice. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs' animation and technological innovations were years ahead of their time, but the film's storytelling quality and entertainment value are timeless. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs not only created a new art form, it validated it. Today, while much of the online conversation about Snow White tends to revolve around bad faith criticisms that it would truly be a waste of my time to debunk, the film's impact on pop culture is still as strongly felt as ever, with Snow White being heavily featured in both Disney merchandise and the Disney theme parks, and the film itself still widely considered to be one of the greatest animated films of all time, and the standard by which other animated films are judged. Nearly a century after its release, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs still occupies the highest level of pop culture success a movie can achieve. However, while we have the benefit of hindsight, Walt Disney and his artists did not, and the question still remained. Upon its release, would Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs resonate with audiences? And would it make enough money to both pay back the bank and keep the Walt Disney Studio in business? Part 6. Disney's Folly. In December of 1937, how the world would react to Snow White wasn't clear. Some people in Hollywood were calling Snow White Disney's Folly, and opinions were mixed as to whether an animated film could work at all, let alone be a hit with audiences. However, press coverage of the upcoming film was mostly positive, and anticipation among the general public seemed to be high. Despite this, however, Walt Disney knew that the normal promotional methods Hollywood typically utilized wouldn't be enough. He needed to make sure audiences were excited about his film, and to do this, he would leverage the same thing that had kept his studio afloat even when the cartoon shorts weren't making money: merchandising. Disney's merchandising arm was run by a man named Kay Kamen, who had turned Mickey Mouse from a cartoon star into a cottage industry. Now Walt needed Kamen to do the same for Snow White. Kamen absolutely delivered on this, and Snow White merchandise started to appear in stores and store display windows even before the opening of the film itself. Perhaps the most notable piece of merchandise for the film was the film's soundtrack, which was released as a set of 3 78 RPM records. It was the first time a movie soundtrack had ever been commercially released. Multiple storybook versions of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were also released, telling the film's story in printed form. Finally, on December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs would hold its world premiere at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles, California.
Blasé Hollywood, accustomed to gala openings, turns out for the most spectacular of them all. The world premiere of the $1.5 million fairy tale fantasy, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Replicas from the first feature cartoon thrill thousands who turn out for a glimpse of lovely Marlene Dietrich with Doug Fairbanks Jr. and a parade of stars. Here's George Arliss, Dean of Stage and Screen, and Luella Parsons, leading Hollywood commentator. Handsome Preston Foster, one of the most popular stars with the fans. Shirley Temple is just as enthralled as are the grown-up stars and moviegoers with the Seven Fantastic Dwarfs. They amuse comical Bob Burns as much as Mickey and Minnie Mouse. From the fertile genius of a great artist comes quacking Donald Duck. Walt Disney, who created these lovable characters, brings to motion pictures a new medium for a greater art. And it looks like a snow-white Christmas for all.
This was no ordinary premiere, however. This was an event. Outside the theater, there was a display called Dwarfland, which featured miniatures of the dwarf's cottage and mine from the film, including a moving water wheel. Artwork from the film and from Disney's short films was also displayed, and costume performers of Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Donald Duck, and the Seven Dwarfs themselves were also in attendance, posing for pictures with the audience. Songs from the film were played by a live orchestra and sung by Adriana Caselotti and Harry Stockwell, the voices of Snow White and the Prince, respectively. Among the audience for the film were numerous celebrities, movie stars, and animation professionals. These included Shirley Temple, Marlene Dietrich, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Helen Vinson, Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Gail Patrick, Hedy Lamarr, Preston Foster, Charlie Chaplin, Joe E. Brown, Frank Capra, George Cukor, Sidney Franklin, Leon Schlesinger, and Hugh Harman. The audience was also full of hundreds of Walt Disney's artists who had worked on the film. The premiere was broadcast live on the radio and filmed for theater newsreels, and many of the attendees were interviewed. Finally, everybody sat down in the theater, the lights went down, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs started to play on the screen. This was it. This was everything the last 4 years of excruciating work had been leading up to. Walt was so nervous that he couldn't let go of his wife Lillian's hand and could barely watch the film. He was instead anxiously looking around at the reactions of the audience around him. Would they like the film? Would they care about what happened? Would they laugh? And most importantly, would they cry? As the film played, the audience seemed enraptured, their eyes remaining glued to the screen. They laughed at the antics of the dwarfs. They recoiled in horror at the evil queen's hideous transformation. They sat on the edge of their seats as the dwarfs rushed to save Snow White. And as the dwarfs cried over Snow White's death, Walt again nervously looked around at the audience. At first, they were completely silent, and Walt wasn't sure if they were captivated or bored. Then, he saw them start to take out their handkerchiefs and wipe their eyes. They were crying. They were crying over Snow White, an animated character. Walt Disney and his artists now knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they had succeeded. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs played at the Carthay Circle Theater for several weeks and consistently sold out night after night. On December 27th, Walt was featured on the cover of Time magazine, which published a glowing review of the film. On January 13th, 1938, Snow White opened at the Radio City Music Hall in New York and again was an enormous hit, with lines of people waiting to get in stretching up to 3 blocks away. Finally, on February 4th, 1938, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was put into wide release. Not just in America, but around the world, including multiple non-English language versions. The film was a massive hit, and became the highest-grossing film of all time up to that point. In addition to Snow White's popularity with the public, critics raved about the film, calling it a classic, a cinematic milestone, and one of the best, if not the best, film of the year. Snow White seemed unstoppable. However, despite its monumental critical and commercial success, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was apparently not good enough for Hollywood's highest honor. That year, when the nominations were announced for the Academy Award for Best Picture, Snow White was bafflingly, insultingly, not nominated, starting a tradition of disrespecting animation that the Academy would continue to this day. However, the following year, 1939, the Academy would give Walt Disney something of a consolation prize, an honorary Academy Award featuring 1 large statuette and 7 miniature statuettes.
I'm sure the boys and girls in the whole world are going to be very happy when they find out that the daddy of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Ferdinand, Mickey Mouse, and all the others, is going to be presented this beautiful statue. Isn't it bright and shiny?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Aren't you proud of it, Mr. Disney?
Well, I'm so proud I think I'll bust.
The award called Snow White a significant screen innovation which has charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field. According to the Time magazine article about Snow White, an interviewer had asked Walt about the film and referred to it as a cartoon. Walt reportedly responded,
"It's no more a cartoon than a painting by Whistler is a cartoon."
Whether or not the Academy recognized Snow White as a genuine work of art didn't matter. Walt and his artists knew it was a masterpiece, and more importantly, the world knew. With the massive profits from Snow White, Walt Disney was officially in the business of feature production, and he and Roy were able to use the money to build a much bigger studio in Burbank that would free them from the spatial constraints of the Hyperion studio. Creating Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had been an uphill battle for Walt Disney all the way, with constraints due to technology, funding, space, staffing, and the need to prove himself to other people constantly standing as obstacles between Walt and the realization of his creative vision. But despite it all, Walt Disney had made his dream come true, and he had done so only through the combined efforts of an army of talented artists. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs may have been the result of a singular creative vision, but it was also the result of hundreds of creative visions, hundreds of dreams dreamed by hundreds of creative dreamers, story writers, sketch artists, background artists, animators, inkers and painters, photographers, and more. In Walt's own words,
"It requires people to make the dream a reality."
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a group effort, and it never would have happened without the contributions of every single creative dreamer who poured their creativity and talent into it. Now, with Snow White playing to adoring audiences all across the world, the Herculean effort was finally over. Walt Disney and his team could finally sit back and take a well-earned rest. But Walt wouldn't do that. He wouldn't do that because he was Walt Disney. And for Walt Disney, there was never time to rest. There was always a new challenge to conquer. And if there was no time for Walt Disney to rest, then there was no time for his employees to rest either. A decision that would definitely not come back to haunt him in only a few years. With his newfound freedom of money and the new studio, Walt was already making plans for his next feature, an animated film that would be even bigger, better, and more ambitious than Snow White. A film which would not be held back by any financial, logistical, or creative constraints. Yes, Walt Disney was embarking on a new creative dream, and this time, nothing would hold him back. This time, there would be no strings on him. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much to my talented voice cast, all of whom you can find down in the description. If you'd like to support this channel and help me make more videos like this, you can do so by joining my Patreon, which is linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching everyone, and remember that you're extraordinary. I love all of you so much, and I'll see you all again real soon. Bye.
Hi-ho, 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 to make your troubles go. Just keep on singing all day long. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. For if you're feeling low, you positively can't go wrong with a hi. Hi-ho, hi-ho, hi-ho. For the work of day, everyone should know just how to be happy when you hear the whistle blow. Just whistle while you work. Put on that grin and start right into whistle loud and long. Just hum a merry tune. Just do your best and take a rest and sing yourself a song.
When there's too much to do, don't let it bother you.
Forget your troubles, try to be just like a cheerful chickadee and whistle while you work. Come on, get smart, tune up and start to whistle while you work. Whistle while you work. Come on, get smart, tune up and start to whistle while you work. We whistle while we work because it makes the hours go. And soon we'll hear a whistle that will say it's time to go. Hi-ho, hi-ho, hi-ho. It's home from work we go. on the